The scream that pulled me off the bench wasn't pain. It was outrage, the kind only a 7-year-old can generate, both fists locked around a die-cast car with one wheel missing, while a boy her size held the other end and refused to let go. I'd promised Tessa 15 quiet minutes. She'd taken a tow call 2 blocks over, some sedan dead in the middle of Willard Street, and left me on playground duty with a look that said, "Don't lose my kid." I'd just lost the argument before I got there. Hey, let go both of you. I crouched between them, hands out, the same flat voice I used on 2 mechanics fighting over the same wrench. Nobody's keeping it if you break it in half first. The boy didn't let go. He looked up at me instead, unimpressed, like I'd interrupted something more important than I understood. That was the first second. The second was worse. He had my jaw, squared off wrong for a kid's face, the way it belonged on someone 20 years older. My eyes, my color of brown, set too serious under a kid's eyebrows. And when he turned to glare at Maisie, I saw the fold in his left ear. A small, crimped notch nobody in my life has ever had, except my father and me. I stood up too fast. My knee didn't like it, and neither did my stomach. Get it together, I told myself. Kids look like other kids. Grief plays tricks on tired men in parking lots. This is a coincidence with an ear, nothing more, and you are not going to make a scene over a coincidence. It was on the ground, the boy said, like he was filing a report. That means it's nobody's yet. Finders keepers isn't a real rule, but it's the rule we're using today. It fell out of my bag, Maisie said. Then don't leave your bag open, he answered, without malice, purely as fact, the way you'd point out a flat tire. New rule. The actual rule. I held my hand out, palm up, and after a second he set the car in it, watching me the way you'd watch a stranger holding your wallet. It fell out of her bag, so it's hers. But you get first turn, since you found it, and that took effort. Maisie opened her mouth to argue, then thought better of it under a look I'd perfected on Tessa's invoices. The boy studied the car, then studied me, weighing whether this was a trick. That's actually fair, he said, sounding almost betrayed by the fact. Most adults just give it to whoever's crying loudest. I'm not big on rewarding volume. Neither am I. Nobody agrees with me, though. I told him I'd agree with him on that one. I handed him the car. He turned it over once, inspected the missing wheel like a mechanic clocking a bad part, then rolled it across the bench and let Maisie snatch it on the rebound, which I suspected had been the actual plan all along. I sat back down slower than I'd stood up, my pulse refusing to catch up with the rest of me, like my body hadn't decided yet whether this was actually an emergency worth having. Do the math, Daniel. 6 years and 3 months since the hospital told you there was nothing left to hold. He looks about right for 6 and change, if you're being honest, which you are trying very hard not to be. Lots of 6-year-olds look about right for 6-year-olds. Not many of them have that ear, though. Not many of them at all. You're staring, the boy said, without looking up from the car. Sorry, long day. You don't look like you had a long day. You look like you saw a ghost. He said it flatly, testing the phrase the way kids test words they've heard adults use and aren't sure they've earned the right to yet. Are you going to be weird about it, or tell me your name? Weird adults usually pick the first one. That got an actual laugh out of me, short and surprised. Daniel. Theo. He didn't offer a hand. He offered the missing wheel instead, holding it up like evidence. This came off before I found it. I want that on the record. Noted. For what it's worth, that's an easy fix. Axle pin, not the wheel. You know how to fix cars? For a living. He considered that with more respect than he'd shown me for anything else so far. Real cars or toy ones? Real ones, mostly. I can do both if you're desperate. I might hold you to that. Maisie, bored of being ignored, announced the car was staying with her forever, which restarted an argument neither of them fully committed to. More ritual than fight. I let it run. It was easier than looking at Theo's ear a second time and having to explain to myself, again, why my hands wouldn't sit still. I was still deciding whether I'd imagined the whole thing when a woman's voice cut across the playground, sharp with the raw panic of a parent who's lost sight of her kid for 90 seconds. Theo. Theo. He didn't even turn around fully. Over here, Mom. I'm fine. Mom. I looked up before I told myself not to. She came around the slide at a near run, dark coat, hair coming loose from a clip. Phone still in one hand, like she'd been mid-call when she looked up and he wasn't there. She reached him, put a hand flat on his shoulder the way you check a wound is still there, started scolding him for wandering off. Then she looked past him, at me. I watched every bit of color leave her face in real time. Not surprise, recognition, the kind that arrives a full second before the brain finishes deciding whether to admit it. Claire, I said. Just the name. I didn't trust myself with a whole sentence yet. And she didn't answer, her hand tightening hard enough that Theo twisted to look up at her, confused. 6 years. She looked the same and completely different, like a house repainted where you can still see the old color underneath if the light hits it right. "We have to go," she said, voice gone thin and fast, already reaching for Theo's other hand, like the exit was the only thing that mattered now. "Claire, wait. One question, that's all." I kept it flat, kept it small, kept everything actually happening in my chest out of my voice, because if I let it in, I was going to say something I couldn't take back in front of a 6-year-old. "How old is he?" "Just the month he was born, Claire. That's all I'm asking you for. One date, and then I'll let you walk away." Her jaw worked. For 1 second, I thought she might actually answer me. Then, it closed again, and something harder moved into her eyes instead. The look of someone doing math of her own and not liking the answer. "Stay away from us." She said it to me, but her hand was already pulling Theo toward the path, and she said it again, quieter, like she was reminding herself more than me. "Stay away from him." "Mom, we were just talking about cars," Theo said, twisting to look back at me. "He's not weird, he's a mechanic." Now, Theo. I didn't move. I want that clear, because it would have been easy to close the distance and demand the one thing I actually wanted, which was 30 more seconds of looking at that ear in good light. I stayed on the bench with my hands flat on my knees, holding myself down by the wrists, like that was a thing a body could do. Maisie watched them go, then looked at me. "Why is his mom mad at you?" "I don't know yet. You know her?" "I used to." That was as much of an answer as I had. And it was true in a way that scared me more than a lie would have. A man in a Park Service vest drifted closer during all of it, rake in hand, clearly torn between minding his own business and not missing whatever this was. He gave up pretending. "You all right there? She came at you like you owed her money. Didn't lay a hand on anybody. You saw that. Didn't say you did." He leaned on the rake. "Lou, I run maintenance out here, which mostly means refereeing toy car wars and cleaning up after golden retrievers. Want me to call someone?" "No, I appreciate it, but no." "Whatever you say, man. You let him walk off easy enough." He shrugged, already losing interest, already thinking about the next thing that would go wrong on his shift. None of my business anyway. He was right. It wasn't. I sat there longer than I should have, watching the empty path where Claire had dragged Theo out of sight, running the numbers again because my hands needed something to do that wasn't shaking. 6 years and 3 months. A hospital notice with a stamp on it I had never once, not for one single day, thought to question. Because why would you question the worst thing anyone has ever told you? It comes from a hospital. Hospitals don't lie about that. That's the one thing you're supposed to be allowed to trust blind. The one door nobody warns you might be dressed up to look locked when it isn't. Except I just watched a woman who used to be my wife look at me like I was the one thing in the world she was afraid would ruin her life. And she hadn't done it because I'd said anything wrong. She'd done it because I was standing next to her son. And something about that had frightened her more than the argument over the car ever could. I didn't chase them. I didn't call after them. Didn't run to my truck to follow. Didn't do a single thing that would let anyone later say the mechanic went unstable in a public park over a kid he'd known for 10 minutes. I sat still and let my son walk away from me for the second time in his life. And I made myself a promise instead of a scene. I was going to find out exactly what that hospital notice actually was. Not what I'd been told it was 6 years ago in the worst week of my life. What it actually, legally, provably was, before I let myself believe one more thing about that ear, that jaw, or that boy who negotiated like he'd been doing it his whole short life. Because if there was even a chance I'd grieved a death that never happened, I was done being the man who trusted a stamp and never once asked what was underneath it. 6 years is a long time to grieve something you never actually confirmed. Tessa rolled back into the lot 20 minutes later, grease on one forearm and a toe hook scar on her patience, and took one look at my face before she'd even cut the engine. "You look like you saw a ghost," she said, echoing a 6-year-old without knowing it. "Yeah," I told her, and meant it more than she could guess. I think I might have seen the opposite. The drive back to the garage was quiet except for Maisie narrating her doll's opinions on the missing wheel from the back seat. I ran the timeline again in my head, the leave request, the 4 days in transit, the notice waiting for me when I finally reached the hospital. Every version still ended in the same place. Someone had told me my son was gone, and grief doesn't leave room to cross-examine the people delivering it. Tessa caught my eye in the rear view once we hit the highway. "You've got that face. The one you get right before you take apart an engine everyone else already gave up on." "Maybe I do. Whatever this is, don't do it alone. That's the whole reason I keep the second bay open for you." She said it lightly, but her eyes didn't move off the road, which meant she meant every word. I didn't answer right away. I was still hearing Claire tell me to stay away from him, and underneath it, quieter. The sound of a boy calling me a mechanic instead of a stranger, like it settled something he needed settled. I had a face, an ear, and a date that might or might not line up, and nothing else to show for it. Not proof. Not anywhere close to proof, no matter how loud my gut argued otherwise. But I had a reason now to stop trusting a piece of paper I should have questioned 6 years ago. And once you start pulling on a thread like that, there is no putting the sweater back the way it was. Vivian Whitmore did not look like a woman who had ever changed her own oil, and she made that very clear the moment she stepped into the garage in cream-colored slacks, picking her way around a puddle of coolant like it might be contagious. I knew who she was before she said a word. Claire used to keep a photo of her on the mantle, the kind you display because you're supposed to, not because you want to. Mr. Mercer. She said my name like she'd rehearsed it in the car. I'd hoped we could speak somewhere with fewer engines. This is where I work. I didn't get up from the transmission I was under. Tessa, 2 bays over, went very still in the way people go still when they're listening hard while pretending not to. Vivian waited a beat too long for me to offer her a chair that didn't exist, then decided to stand instead. Handbag held in front of her like a shield. Then I'll be brief. You gave my daughter quite a fright yesterday. I asked her a question. She didn't answer it. You approached a small boy you don't know and made his mother panic in public. Her voice stayed even, almost kind, the voice you'd use to explain a parking ticket to someone you pitied. I understand grief does strange things to a person's judgment. I'm not here to blame you for that. I wiped my hands on a rag and finally stood, because I wasn't going to have this conversation flat on my back looking up at her shoes. Then why are you here? Because I'd like to help you. She set an envelope on the workbench, careful not to let it touch anything greasy. A fresh start, somewhere else if you'd like. Enough to build a real life, without the weight of the past following you around every playground in Bellhaven. I looked at the envelope longer than I meant to, mostly because it told me more than she wanted it to. Nobody pays a stranger to disappear over a coincidence. You're offering me money to stay away from a kid I met for the first time yesterday. I'm offering a grieving man a chance to stop chasing ghosts. She said it smoothly, but her eyes flicked once toward Tessa's bay, cataloging the peeling paint and the toe-hook scars on the concrete, filing it all away as evidence of something. Theo is settled. He's loved. He has a father in every sense that matters. What you saw was resemblance, nothing more, and I would hate for a misunderstanding to cost you everything you've built here. That sounded like a threat wearing a nice coat. It was an observation. Small businesses are fragile things, reputations even more so. She smiled, and it didn't reach anywhere close to her eyes. A man recently discharged, approaching children he doesn't know at a playground. People talk, whether or not there's any truth to it. Tessa came around the bay wiping her hands, unhurried, the way she moved when she was actually furious. Ma'am, I don't know you, but you're standing in my shop threatening my business partner, so I'm going to need you to say whatever comes next real slow. I threatened no one. I offered a kindness. Vivian's gaze slid over Tessa exactly once, pricing her the way she'd price the concrete. Perhaps you'd like to explain that to your commercial clients, if it ever comes to that. Get out, Tessa said, still pleasant, still smiling, and somehow that was worse than shouting. I mean that, with real warmth. Get out of my garage. Vivian didn't move yet, and neither did I. There's a version of that moment where I take the envelope, not out of greed, but out of 6 years of being tired, of wondering whether the fight is even worth it if the prize was never real to begin with. I thought about it for exactly as long as it took to breathe once. I picked the envelope up, felt the weight of it, and held it back out to Vivian without opening it. I'm not taking your money. I'm not disappearing. I'm not going to threaten anybody either, so don't go telling Claire I did. I just want to know one thing, and it isn't for sale. And what is that? Whether my son actually died or whether somebody told me he did. Saying it without heat cost me something. You don't have to answer that today. I already know how to find out. For the first time, something moved behind her composure, quick and gone, like a door opening a crack before someone remembered to shut it. You'll find that grief invents connections where none exist. I'd hate to watch you humiliate yourself chasing one. Then it'll cost me nothing to check and find you're right. She took the envelope back with 2 fingers, like it had been contaminated by contact with me, and left without another word, heels sharp against the concrete. Tessa watched her all the way to a car that cost more than the garage's entire quarter. Well, she said once the door swung shut, that woman drove here to threaten a mechanic over a playground argument. That's not the behavior of somebody with nothing to hide, Daniel. No, it isn't. So what do we actually do with that? I already had an answer. One I'd been sitting on since I woke up at 4 that morning, unable to sleep. I go find out what that death notice actually was, not what I was told. what it legally is. Tessa didn't argue, which from her was its own kind of blessing. She just handed me a card from the drawer under the register, corners soft from handling. Elena Ruiz, family law, does a sliding scale for vets. She helped Marcus from the parts counter sort his custody mess 2 years back. Call her before you do anything you can't walk back, and don't let that woman's car get inside your head about what you're worth. Elena's office was 2 rooms above a dry cleaner, no assistant, a coffee maker that had clearly seen better decades. She read my face before I'd said much of anything, and didn't warm up the way most people did once I explained the army, the leave, the hospital. Let me be honest with you, because I think you'd rather I was, she said, setting down her pen. Men come through that door all the time convinced a child is theirs, and that the world owes them for it. Some are right. A lot are chasing something that isn't actually about the child at all. I've learned to tell the difference slowly, not on the first visit. Which one am I? She studied me a moment longer than was comfortable. I don't know yet. That's usually the honest answer, and anyone who tells you different in the first 10 minutes is selling something. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to help me check one specific fact. I laid it out plain. The notice, the date, the 4 days in transit, the cremation Vivian had claimed was already arranged before I even landed. If there's a real death certificate with my son's name on it, I need to see it, and I'll walk away and grieve properly this time. If there isn't, I need to know that too. Something in her expression shifted, not warmth exactly, but professional attention, replacing professional caution. That I can do. A civil death registration is public record if you know where to look and what name to request it under. Give me a few days, and Mr. Mercer, whatever you find, don't do anything with it alone. Come back here first. Those few days were the longest I'd spent since the leave request itself, back when 4 days felt like a war crime committed against me personally. I kept working, kept my hands busy on things that had actual, fixable problems. Tessa watched me, the way you watch a kettle you're pretty sure is about to boil over. And twice, she found reasons to hand me the easy jobs instead of the ones that needed real concentration, which I noticed and didn't thank her for out loud. Elena called on the 4th day, and I could hear in her voice before she said a word that the answer wasn't what either of us had expected walking in. There is no valid civil death registration matching a male infant born to Claire Whitmore, or under your name in that window, Mr. Mercer. Not at Whitmore Memorial, not anywhere in the county. What you were given 6 years ago was an internal hospital notice. It was never filed as an actual death. I sat with that longer than I should have on a phone call I was paying for by the minute. So there's no record my son ever died. There's no record he died. That is not the same thing as a record that he lived, and it is nowhere close to proof of who you think he is. I want to be very clear about that before you do anything rash. Her voice sharpened into something almost protective. But it does mean somebody handed you a document that was never what they told you it was. That's not grief playing tricks. That's a fact, and facts don't care how it makes you feel. I thanked her, hung up, and sat in the garage office a long time with my hands flat on the desk, the same way I'd held myself down on that bench 2 days before. Vivian had called it grief inventing connections. Grief doesn't forge paperwork. People do that. The pressure came fast after that, faster than I expected for a woman who'd only just failed to buy me off in an afternoon. Tessa took a call from Bill Hargrove, whose fleet of delivery vans accounted for 1/3 of our monthly bookings, asking careful, oddly specific questions about whether everything was all right at the shop. Whether he'd heard correctly that one of the owners had some kind of trouble with a family down at the Whitmore Foundation, and whether that was the kind of thing that might, down the line, reflect on a company that put its name on his vans every week. I told him you were the best mechanic in this city, and none of his business besides, Tessa said afterward, jaw tight, wiping down a wrench she didn't need to wipe down. But that call didn't come out of nowhere, Daniel. Somebody made it their business to plant that seed in one single afternoon. Vivian. She said the name like it tasted bad. So we know 2 things now. Whatever you saw at that playground, it's real enough that she panicked into an envelope of cash inside a day. And she's not above using our livelihood to make you back off. I looked at the missing record printout Elena had emailed over, the one that proved nothing except that I'd been lied to by somebody with a hospital letterhead 6 years ago. In the 1 week of my life, I was least equipped to argue with a piece of paper. It wasn't proof of a son. It wasn't proof of anything except that the ground I'd been grieving on for 6 years had never actually been solid. A woman with a car worth more than my garage had decided I was cheap enough to buy and dangerous enough to warn off in the same visit. Then I guess we find out how much she's willing to spend proving I'm the unstable one, I said, and Tessa handed me a fresh rag without being asked, which from her was the closest thing to a battle cry I was going to get, because I'm not stopping now. Claire's text arrived 4 days after Vivian's envelope failed. 6 words long, 30 minutes, public. Graham will be there. No apology, no explanation, just terms, the way you'd negotiate with someone you didn't trust not to make a scene. I read it standing in the garage bay with grease still under my nails and felt something unclench for the first time since the playground. I texted back one word, okay. Tessa made me change my shirt before I left, on the grounds that I smelled like a transmission and looked like a man who hadn't slept, both of which were true. Don't oversell it, she said. Just be the guy who fixes things. That's who you actually are. And it's worked on every stray dog and stubborn client we've ever had walk through that door. I told her Theo wasn't a stray dog. She said the principle still applied. The Bellhaven Community Center had a long workshop table by the windows, the kind of neutral, well-lit, camera-adjacent space Claire had clearly chosen on purpose. Public enough to feel safe, small enough that nobody could accuse anybody of hiding anything. Graham got there first. I knew him before Claire said his name, mostly because he stood like a man used to being the calm one in a room, hands loose at his sides, already positioned half a step in front of where Theo would eventually sit. Daniel. He offered a handshake. Firm, not unfriendly, the handshake of someone who had decided in advance to be reasonable about this. Graham Hale. I work with kids for a living, so I hope you don't mind if I stay close. Wouldn't expect anything else. I meant it. A man who didn't stay close to another man's kid at a meeting like this would have told me something worse about him than caution ever could. Claire came in a minute later with Theo trailing half a step behind her, one hand jammed in his jacket pocket, the other clutching something I couldn't see yet. She looked like she hadn't slept much better than I had, though she'd put more effort into hiding it. 30 minutes, she said again, out loud this time, like repeating it made it more binding. At this table, Graham stays. I stay. You don't touch him. You don't ask him anything about. She stopped herself, jaw working, unwilling to finish the sentence in front of Theo. You just talk. That's fair. I sat down across from where Theo would sit, not next to him, and didn't reach for anything. Theo studied the arrangement like a kid clocking a rigged game. Then he pulled his hand out of his pocket and set the die-cast car on the table between us, missing wheel and all. You said axle pin, he announced, without any greeting at all, not the wheel. I want to see if that's actually true. Or if you were just saying something adults say to sound smart. Graham's eyebrows went up a fraction. Claire's hand tightened on the back of a chair. I felt something loosen in my own shoulders, because this, at least, was a problem I actually knew how to solve. Fair test. I turned the car over, found the pin exactly where I expected it, and worked it free with a fingernail, and more patience than force. See that little metal rod? That's what actually holds the axle in the frame. The wheel was never the problem. It just looked like the problem. Theo leaned in close enough that his hair nearly brushed my hand, watching with total, uncomplicated focus. So, the wheel's fine. It just needed the pin put back. Exactly. People do that a lot. Blame the part they can see instead of the part underneath it that actually broke. I didn't look up when I said it, but I felt Claire go very still. Graham cleared his throat, gentle, deliberate. That's a nice way of putting things, Daniel. Theo mentioned you're recently out of the service. That's a big adjustment for anyone, coming back to civilian life. It is. I clicked the wheel back onto the axle and set the car spinning on the table with one finger, a small, perfect circle. And Theo grinned before he caught himself and stopped. I run a garage now, with a friend. Keeps my hands busy. And before that, you were overseas for a long stretch. Graham's tone stayed pleasant, but the question underneath it wasn't. I only ask because Claire mentioned things ended abruptly between you two. I'd hate for Theo to get attached to someone who might deploy again without much warning. I heard what he was actually asking, and understood exactly why, because I'd have asked it too in his position. I'm out. Permanently. 3 months now. Nobody's shipping me anywhere, and I didn't choose to end things abruptly with anyone. That decision got made a long way from me, in a hospital I couldn't reach in time. Claire's eyes flicked up at that, sharp, and for 1 second I thought she might actually argue with me in front of her son. She didn't. She looked down at the table instead, at the fixed car spinning slower now, and said nothing at all. Theo, oblivious to the current running under the table, snatched the car back, and inspected the repair with a mechanic's suspicion. It's not going to fall off again the second I get home, is it? Because last time somebody fixed something with tape and it fell off in like a day. Who fixed it with tape? Graham. He's better at other stuff. Theo said it without malice, a plain fact delivered like all his facts. Graham's jaw tightened just slightly before he recovered into a smile. I'll cop to that. Small engines and I have an understanding. We stay far apart and nobody gets hurt. It was a good line, self-deprecating, disarming. I filed it away too. A staff volunteer came by with juice boxes for the kids in the workshop room, and Theo took one, jabbed the straw in with the same brisk efficiency he'd shown the whole meeting. He drank half of it while narrating an argument with a kid named Priya about whether Pluto still counted as a planet, a debate he clearly considered far from settled. He set the half-finished juice box down on the table between us when he was done, forgotten. Condensation beating on the cardboard, close enough that I could have palmed it without either adult noticing. I looked at it longer than I meant to. Elena's voice arrived in my head before I'd even finished the thought. An uncontrolled sample proves nothing to anyone but you. It would tell me what I already believed in my gut, and nothing that would hold up anywhere that mattered. Worse, it would make me exactly the kind of man Claire already suspected I was. The kind who takes what he wants off a table, when nobody's looking, and calls it fatherhood afterward. I wasn't going to hand Vivian that story for free. I nudged the juice box back toward Theo instead, gently with one finger, the same finger I'd used to spin the car. You're gonna want to finish that before it gets warm. Nothing worse than warm juice. It's already warm. It's been out for like 10 minutes. He said it like I'd failed a basic test of object permanence, took it anyway, and finished it in 3 long pulls, unaware of what he just handed me and what I just refused to take. Claire watched the whole exchange, without seeming to understand what she'd actually watched. But Graham did, I think, or came close to it, his eyes tracking the juice box the way you track something that almost mattered and then didn't. The 30 minutes ran out faster than any 30 minutes I could remember in years. Claire stood first, already reaching for Theo's jacket, already narrating the transition the way parents do when they're managing an exit more than a departure. All right, bud, time to go. Say goodbye. Can he come again? Theo said it to Claire, not to me, cutting her off mid-sentence, the die-cast car still clutched in one fist like he wasn't ready to let go of the fixed thing yet. He knows the pin thing. Nobody else knew the pin thing. Claire's whole face did something complicated, something that wasn't quite panic, and wasn't quite grief, and wasn't quite anger, all 3 fighting for the same real estate across her face. We'll talk about it, Theo, not today. That's a grown-up way of saying no. Theo looked at me instead of her, flat and matter-of-fact, checking whether I'd correct her or confirm it, testing which kind of adult I actually was now that nobody had scripted the moment for me. Sometimes it is, I said, because lying to him felt like the one thing that would actually cost me everything. But sometimes, grown-ups need a minute to catch up to what a kid already figured out. I'm not going anywhere either way. He considered that with the same suspicion he'd given the missing wheel, weighing it against everything he'd seen me do in 30 minutes. Whatever he found must have passed some private inspection, because he nodded once, short, like closing a file. Graham walked them both to the door with a hand hovering near Theo's shoulder, not touching, just present. He gave me one last look over his shoulder that wasn't hostile so much as recalculating, a man revising a plan he'd been confident about 10 minutes earlier. I sat at the workshop table a while after they'd gone. I turned the whole 30 minutes over the way Theo had turned the car over, looking for the part that had actually broken. I hadn't proven anything. I hadn't asked for anything. I'd fixed a toy and declined a juice box, and somehow that had been the whole test. My phone rang that evening while I was closing up the garage, an unfamiliar Bellhaven number, and a woman's brisk, professional voice on the other end introduced herself as Mrs. Alvarez from the front office at Fairmont Elementary. "I'm calling as a courtesy, Mr. Mercer. Nothing more," she said, in the tone of someone who'd made calls like this before and didn't enjoy any of them. "We received a request today, through the family, to add your name to our restricted contact list for student Theodore Whitmore. I've never even set foot on that campus. I didn't know which school he went to until you just told me. I understand. This isn't a judgment of you. It's just procedure, once a family requests it. I'm only required to inform you it's in place, and that it applies at pickup, drop-off, and any school event." I thanked her for the call, because she hadn't done anything wrong. I hung up feeling the bone-deep tired that comes from losing ground I hadn't even known I was standing on. Vivian hadn't waited to see if her bribe would fail before deciding what came after it. She'd had this ready the whole time, a second door already built before I'd finished walking through the first one. Whatever this actually was, it wasn't going to be settled at a workshop table with a fixed toy car, however much I wanted it to be. I called Tessa on the drive home, mostly because I needed to hear a voice that wasn't measuring me for a lawsuit. Theo wants to see me again, I told her. And apparently I'm now banned from a school I've never visited. For a kid I've technically never even been told is mine. That's… She paused, and I could hear her doing the same math I'd been doing all the way home. That's a strange kind of progress, Daniel. He wants you around, and she's already building a wall to keep you out before you've done a single wrong thing to earn it. That's exactly it. I pulled into the garage lot, cut the engine, and sat there a minute in the dark, which means I've got to figure out how to want him back without giving her a single real reason to point at. Tessa got stuck under a customer's SUV with a stripped oil pan bolt at exactly the wrong hour. So I was the one who drove to Fairmont Elementary that Thursday to collect Maisie, same as I'd done a dozen times before Theo's face had ever complicated the arrangement. I told myself that on the whole drive over actually, like repeating it might make it more true. I wasn't going there for him. I was going there for a 7-year-old who liked to be picked up in a truck instead of a sedan. Elena had warned me, on our last call, that a restricted contact request could turn any ordinary presence near that school into a story somebody else got to tell about me. I knew that. I went anyway because Maisie needed a ride, and I refused to let a piece of paper decide where I was and wasn't allowed to be useful to the people who actually needed me. The pickup loop ran along a low chain-link fence, parents idling in a slow crawl of minivans while kids filed out in their color-coded class lines. I parked, cut the engine, and got out to stand by the fence the way I always did, hands in my pockets, waiting for Maisie's line. A woman in a school-issued vest peeled off from the crowd and came toward me before I'd been standing there 30 seconds, moving with the brisk, no-nonsense energy of someone who'd rather get an awkward conversation over with than let it simmer. "Mr. Mercer?" She kept her voice low, angled her body so the parents nearby wouldn't clock it as anything but small talk. "Hannah Park, I teach first grade. I wanted to introduce myself before you heard about the list from somebody less kind about it." "I already heard. Front office called me last night." "Good. Then you know I'm required to keep you at the fence line, not past it, if Theodore's class comes through while you're here." She said his full name carefully, like she'd practiced saying it neutrally. The way you handle something you don't want to drop in front of witnesses. I'm not thrilled about the position, for what it's worth. Nobody trained me for this part of the job. You don't have to apologize to me. You're just doing your job. I know. I still don't love how I got handed it. She glanced past me, back toward the school doors, then lowered her voice further. "I heard how the community center meeting went, secondhand, from the coordinator who watched it. You didn't do anything that concerned her, and she doesn't impress easily. That matters more to me than a letter with a foundation letterhead." "Then why the list?" "Because a family with money asked for one, and my job is keeping kids safe, not litigating who's right in a custody argument I'm not part of." She held my eyes a second longer than was comfortable. "I judge what I actually see, Mr. Mercer, not what somebody's lawyer typed up. Just so you know that going in, before you decide whether to trust me." I thanked her, and she peeled off again before I could ask anything else, back into the crowd of parents and buses, leaving me alone at the fence with a promise I intended to keep, even though every part of me wanted to test its edges. Theo's class came through 4 minutes later, and he spotted me before I'd even finished bracing for it, his whole face lighting with the specific delight of a kid who has just found something unexpected and good in a boring line of children. "Daniel!" He broke half a step out of formation, car still clutched in one fist from the meeting 3 days ago, the same one I'd fixed, and started toward the fence like there was nothing in the world stopping him. "Hey, bud." I didn't move. I kept both hands visible, kept my feet planted exactly where they'd been since Hannah Park walked away, and made myself smile like this was easy. "Gotta stay with your line today, okay? Your teacher's got rules, and rules matter." He stopped a few feet short, confusion crossing his face fast and unguarded, the kind kids haven't learned to hide yet. "Why? You're right there. You could just come get me like Graham does sometimes." "I'm not on the list of people who can do that. It's not my rule, and it's not really about you being bad or me being bad. Sometimes there's just a boundary, and the right thing is to respect it even when it feels dumb." "That's a really weird answer." He said it flatly, studying me across the 4 feet of asphalt like he was checking the axle pin all over again, testing whether this explanation would hold weight the way the last one had. "Mom didn't say anything about a list. Ask her about it. She'll explain it better than I can from way over here." My voice stayed even and light as I could make it, because the alternative was letting 6 feet of empty pavement crack something open in my chest that I couldn't afford to show a 6-year-old. A woman near the fence, blonde ponytail, phone already half raised like she'd been waiting for exactly this moment, took a slow step closer with the studied casualness of someone pretending not to eavesdrop while doing exactly that. I recognized the type before I recognized the face. Vivian wasn't there in person, but she didn't need to be. She'd built a room full of witnesses and left the actual watching to whoever showed up, which was its own kind of efficient cruelty. Two other mothers nearby had gone quiet in the loaded way people do when they've noticed something and are deciding how to describe it later, over coffee, to somebody who wasn't there to see it firsthand at all. "You could come closer," Theo tried again. Quieter now, less certain, testing whether persistence might work where the first ask hadn't. "Nobody's really looking. I could just walk over real quick." "No, bud. That's exactly the kind of thing that would make this a lot worse for both of us, even if nobody's looking the way you think." I crouched down to his exact height without crossing the fence line, close enough to talk plain, far enough to keep every rule intact. "Here's the truth. Since you asked for one instead of a grown-up answer, I want to come get you every single day. I want that a lot. But if I break somebody's rule today just because it's inconvenient, I lose the right to ask you to trust my word tomorrow. I'm not willing to spend that on one bad afternoon, even if the afternoon is right now and it stings." He considered that with the same suspicious weight he gave everything, jaw working the way his mother's did when she was deciding whether to believe something. That's actually a pretty good reason. It's still dumb though. Most good reasons are dumb from where you're standing. Doesn't make them wrong. That got the smallest crack of a smile out of him, gone almost before I caught it. A teacher's aide called his name and the line moved, and he went, throwing one look back over his shoulder that I felt land somewhere in my sternum and stay there for the rest of the day, long after the truck was parked back at the garage. The ponytailed woman lowered her phone, visibly disappointed, and drifted back toward her own kids' line without ever once looking directly at me, which told me everything about what she'd been hoping to catch on camera and hadn't gotten. Maisie came through her line a minute later, oblivious to all of it, already narrating a full report on a classroom hamster crisis, and I lifted her into the truck grateful for one uncomplicated conversation in the middle of a day that had offered exactly none. A regular named Osei was signing for his Corolla in the lot, a man whose timing belt I'd done in the rain last winter for barely over the price of the part. He gave me the nod that used to come with a handshake, minus the handshake, and left a little faster than usual. It was a small thing, the kind of small thing that adds up to a contract review if enough people do it quietly in the same week, each of them sure they're the only one. The rumor had outpaced me the way gossip does in a school parking lot full of idle parents with nothing better to refresh than a group chat, and Tessa met me at the door with a look I recognized from the day Vivian first walked in. "Bill Hargrove's office called an hour ago," she said, no preamble, wiping her hands on a rag she didn't need. "Not him this time. His fleet manager. Said corporate wants to formally review the maintenance contract before the renewal date, given some concerns raised about the shops, and I'm quoting this exactly, community reputation." She said the phrase like it had a bad taste attached to it. Community reputation. I said the words back slow, tasting how absurd they were next to a 6-year-old asking me to just walk over real quick. I stood at a fence and didn't move. That's the whole crime. I know that. You know that. Everybody at that pickup line who actually watched knows that. Tessa leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, some of the fight going out of her posture, and something harder moving in behind it. "But a rumor doesn't need to be true, Daniel. It just needs enough people repeating it before somebody with a contract to sign hears it secondhand, from a parent who wasn't even looking at the fence when it mattered." I thought about Hannah Park's flat, unimpressed voice at the fence, the one witness in the whole afternoon who'd actually looked at what happened instead of what she'd been told to expect. "I judge what I actually see, Mr. Mercer. It wasn't much. It was something." Then I guess we find out whether Hargrove's the kind of man who reviews what actually happened or the kind who reviews what he heard happened, I said. And Tessa didn't answer right away because we both already suspected which kind paid faster and asked fewer questions. I thought about the fence line the whole drive home that night, about how staying still had cost me something real and gained me something I couldn't yet put a price on. Vivian wanted a story where I broke a rule the first time it was inconvenient. I hadn't given her one, and that refusal was starting to feel like the only weapon I actually had. Bill Hargrove came to the garage himself instead of sending his fleet manager, which Tessa read as either a good sign or a very bad one, and refused to guess which until he actually got out of his car. He was older than I expected, gray at the temples, the kind of man who'd built a delivery company from 2 vans into 30 and still checked his own tire pressure out of habit. He shook my hand first, which I noticed, and Tessa's second, which she noticed harder. I want to say up front, this isn't personal, he said, standing in the bay like a man who'd rather be anywhere else. You two have kept my fleet running clean for 6 years. That counts for something with me. But Tessa crossed her arms, already 3 steps ahead of him, reading the room the way she read a bad engine noise. There's a but coming, Bill. Let's hear it. But my board's asking questions I can't wave off with 6 years of good invoices. Somebody reached out to my office directly, not a rumor, an actual call, suggesting my company's exposure could look bad if a mechanic connected to my fleet is caught up in a custody dispute with a name like Whitmore attached. Somebody with a foundation to protect and a lot of free time, I said. I'm guessing she didn't leave a name. She didn't need to. I looked up who runs donor relations for half the family services boards in this city, Daniel. It wasn't hard math. Hargrove rubbed the back of his neck, uncomfortable in a way that told me this conversation cost him something too. She suggested, real polite, that if the shop's ownership structure changed, the concern would go away on its own. Tessa went very still. The flat stillness I'd learned meant she was doing the math on exactly how much this was going to hurt before she let herself react to it. Meaning what, exactly, Bill? Say it plain. Meaning if Daniel steps back from the public side of the business, quietly, no big announcement, just not the name on the sign anymore. My board's comfortable renewing. If not, I've got to walk it up the chain for a vote I honestly don't know I can win for you. I felt the offer land the way you feel a wrench slip, a half second of nothing before the actual pain arrives. 6 years of Tessa keeping this place alive by herself before I'd ever walked back into it. And now the fastest way to save it was apparently for me to disappear from it too. Give me a minute with my partner, I said, and Hargrove nodded, grateful for the excuse to step back out into the lot and check his phone. The universal gesture of a man who wanted no part of watching what came next. Don't, Tessa said before I'd even opened my mouth. I can see you doing the math already, Daniel. I can see it on your face like a check engine light. Don't you dare offer to sell out of my garage to fix a problem some rich woman invented out of thin air. It's not selling out, it's protecting what you built before I ever showed up. 1/3 of our bookings, Tessa. I can find other work. This place can't replace Hargrove overnight. You think I don't know that? I've been doing this math since he pulled into the lot. She stepped closer, jabbing a finger toward my chest without quite touching it, the way she did when she was too angry to be gentle about a point. But if I let you walk away from your own name over a threat that isn't even about the actual work we do, I'm not protecting this place. I'm handing it to her anyway, just slower. That's not the same thing. It's exactly the same thing. You disappear today because a woman with money whispered in the right ear, and tomorrow it's something else, because she's learned it works. You think Vivian Whitmore stops at one demand once she finds out demands get results? Tessa's voice cracked just slightly, the first real crack I'd heard in her since this whole thing started. I didn't keep this place open through 2 recessions and a pandemic to hand the keys to a woman who's never once changed her own oil. I didn't have an answer for that, mostly because she was right, and I hated how completely right she was. So what do we do instead? We show him the actual work. Not the rumor, not the invoice, the work. She was already moving, already grabbing the clipboard off the wall, already thinking 3 steps past the argument into something that looked a lot more like a plan. Bill's fleet has a van in rotation that's been overdue for a transmission flush for 2 months because his last shop kept quoting him double what it should cost. Get it in here. Today, let's show him what he's actually paying for. Hargrove came back in when Tessa waved him over, wary, clearly expecting a negotiation and getting a work order instead. Van 41's transmission fluid is 3 shades darker than it should be, Tessa told him, flat and businesslike, no pleading in it at all. Your last shop's been overcharging you to underservice it for a year. Pull it off route and bring it here today. No charge for the diagnostic, and we'll show you exactly what you've actually been buying from us. That's not really what I came here to discuss. I know. But it's the only argument I've got that isn't about a woman neither of us has ever actually worked with. Tessa held his eyes, steady, unimpressed by his discomfort. You want to make a decision about my business. Make it about my business. Hargrove had the van there inside 2 hours, and I spent the afternoon with my head under it while he watched, arms crossed, saying almost nothing, the way men like him watch anything they're actually trying to learn something from instead of just tolerate. Tessa worked the phones the whole time, calling 2 other fleet clients we'd never bothered pitching hard, just to prove to herself, and maybe to me, that Hargrove wasn't the only door left standing if this one closed on us. I walked him through it as I went. Not performing, just narrating the way I'd narrate it to Tessa or to myself. See this color? That's not just old fluid. That's fluid that's been running hot for months, Which means somewhere in your last shop's paperwork there's a service they billed you for and never actually did right. You're telling me I've been paying for nothing. I'm telling you your last shop found the cheapest fix and billed you for the expensive one. That's not an opinion. That's what's sitting in this pan. I held it up so he could see it himself, thick and dark, and telling its own story better than I ever could. This is the actual thing I'm good at, Mr. Hargrove, not custody disputes. This. He was quiet a long moment, crouched next to me looking at a transmission pan like it had personally offended him. Which, in a way, it had. How much to do it right? Half what your last shop charged you to do it wrong, Tessa said from behind us, arms still crossed, voice carrying the plain satisfaction of a woman watching her own argument prove itself in real time. We'll have a full breakdown on your desk by Friday. Every van, every service, every dollar compared against what you were actually getting before. Hargrove straightened up slowly, wiping his hands on a rag Tessa handed him without being asked, looking between the two of us like a man recalculating a decision he'd walked in fairly sure of. I'm not going to lie to you. I still can't sign the renewal today. My board's going to want to see that report, and they're going to want to see this doesn't turn into a headline. That's fair, I said, and meant it. Because it was more room than I'd expected to get an hour ago. It's not a yes. It's not the no you walked in with either. No, it's not. He almost smiled, tired and a little rueful. I'll hold the review open, pending that report, instead of pushing it to a vote next week. That's the best I can do without more spine than I apparently have today, and I'd rather be honest about that than pretend otherwise. It wasn't a rescue. The account stayed frozen instead of lost, which was its own kind of relief and its own kind of unfinished business. The ledger neither closed nor healed, just held very carefully in place by one afternoon of proof instead of promises. No board vote, no headline, no magic number that fixed everything Vivian had set in motion with one phone call to a man she'd never bothered meeting. Just a stained pan of transmission fluid, and a report Tessa would spend her whole weekend building instead of resting. Tessa didn't celebrate once he'd gone. She just looked at the transmission pan, then at me, then let out a breath, like she'd been holding it since Hargrove's car first pulled into the lot that morning. We didn't save it. We bought it time. That's not nothing, Daniel. But it's not nothing costing us either. Bill's a decent man, but decent men still answer to boards. I know. I thought about the offer I'd almost taken. The version of today where I quietly stopped being the name on the sign, and Tessa never had to jab a finger at my chest to talk me out of it. Thank you for not letting me do the easy thing back there. The easy thing's rarely the right thing. You'd know that if you weren't currently trying to give away half your life to fix a problem that isn't even yours to fix alone. She flicked the rag at me, more affection in it than heat. Go home. You look like you fought a transmission and lost, which I suppose today you sort of did. My phone rang on the drive home, and this time it actually was Claire. Her name on the screen for the first time since the playground, which stopped my breath for one full second before I answered it. I heard about Hargrove, she said. No greeting. Straight into it. Which told me the parent grapevine ran faster than I'd given it credit for. The whole review. I heard you didn't threaten anyone, didn't fight it, just showed up and did the work. That's about the size of it. I didn't see much point in doing it any other way, not with a kid's whole opinion of me riding on it. I've watched you refuse money. I've watched you hold a fence line while my son begged you to break it. Now I've watched you nearly lose a third of your business rather than do anything Vivian could point to as proof she was right about you. Claire's voice was tight, controlled, but something underneath it had shifted. Some calculation finally landing somewhere new. I keep waiting for you to become the man she says you are, and you keep not doing it. I'm not going to become him just because it would be more convenient for everybody, Claire, including me some days. She was quiet long enough that I thought the call had dropped. I want to do the DNA test, properly, through a clinic, with paperwork, nothing private, nothing either of us can argue about later. Her voice cracked on the last part, small and human, in a way I hadn't heard from her since long before the hospital. I need to actually know, Daniel, not guess. No. I pulled over before I answered her, because some conversations deserve both hands and your full attention instead of a steering wheel. Yes, whenever you want, wherever you want. I'm not going anywhere, Claire, no matter what this costs me to prove it. I know, she said, quiet, almost like it scared her more than reassured her. That's sort of the problem, Daniel. It always has been with you. The clinic called it a 99.99% probability of paternity, which is apparently the polite scientific way of saying yes without quite committing to the word, and Elena read it to me over the phone in the same flat voice she used for everything else. There's no ambiguity here, Mr. Mercer. Theodore Whitmore is your biological son. A pause, careful, the kind she used when she wanted a sentence to actually land instead of just arrive. How you feel about that number is entirely up to you. The number itself doesn't care. I sat in the garage office a long while after I hung up, staring at nothing, waiting for the moment to feel like the earthquake I'd expected. It didn't. It felt more like finally reading a diagnosis you'd already privately made 6 weeks ago and just needed someone else to confirm out loud. Tessa found me there 20 minutes later, still sitting, still staring, and didn't ask what had happened because my face apparently told her everything she needed. She just pulled the second chair over and sat with me in silence until I was ready to talk, which took a while. "It's real," I finally said. "He's mine. Actually, legally, provably mine." "I know," Tessa said, gentle for once. "No jokes in it at all. I've known since the ear thing, Daniel. I just needed the paperwork to catch up to what everyone with eyes already saw." I waited for the number to feel like a victory, the way I'd imagined it would back when victory was still an abstract idea instead of a folder Elena would email me. Mostly it just felt like a door finally opening onto a hallway with several more locked doors in it. Claire called that evening, her voice careful in a way I hadn't heard from her since the divorce papers arrived 6 years ago. "I told him," she said, without preamble. "I told Theo what the test showed. I thought you should know before you hear it from anyone else." "How'd he take it?" The silence on the line went on long enough that I understood the answer before she gave it to me in words. Not the way either of us probably hoped. "He didn't cheer, Daniel. He asked me if that meant he had to start calling you Dad now. And when I said that was his choice, he got quiet and went to his room." "That's fair. That's more than fair, actually. I meant it, even though it cost something to say out loud. A piece of paper doesn't rewrite 6 years of memories just because it changed what an adult calls him. He's allowed to be confused. He's more than confused. He's angry, Daniel, and I don't think he entirely knows who he's angry at." Claire's voice cracked slightly on the last word. The first real crack I'd heard from her in this whole ordeal. "Angry at me, probably, for not coming sooner. Angry at you, maybe, for whatever he's decided you did. Angry at himself for caring either way. If I know anything about 6-year-olds who'd rather look furious than look scared. There's a family meeting Thursday. Elena set it up. Vivian insisted on attending. I couldn't stop that part, and I'm sorry for it, even though I know you'll say I don't need to be." The meeting happened in a borrowed conference room above a title company downtown, neutral ground with a long table, bad coffee, and windows that looked out over a parking lot instead of anything worth looking at. I got there early on purpose, wanting the room to already feel familiar by the time everyone else walked in and started deciding things about my son without me. Elena sat at the head like a referee who already suspected the match would go long and had brought extra patience to cover it. Vivian arrived in a charcoal suit instead of her usual cream, dressed for battle rather than charity this time, and took the seat directly across from me without so much as a glance at the coffee. Claire sat beside her mother. Graham sat beside Claire, jaw tight, hands folded like a man bracing for a verdict he'd already privately guessed the shape of. Elena had called me an hour before to say exactly 3 things. Ask for less than I wanted, let Vivian talk herself into a corner, and do not, under any circumstances, raise my voice in that room, no matter what got said to me in it. "Let's be efficient," Elena said, opening a folder she barely needed to reference. "The results are not in dispute. Mr. Mercer is Theodore's biological father. What remains in dispute is what happens next, and I'd like to start by hearing what each of you actually wants, not what you're afraid of losing. I want minimal supervised contact. I said it before anyone else could frame the request for me, plain and small, the way I'd rehearsed it in the truck on the drive over. Not custody, not removing Graham from anything, just a real, regular, small place in his life that grows at his pace, not mine." The room went quiet in a way that told me it wasn't the opening move anyone had prepared for, least of all Vivian, who had clearly walked in ready for a fight I hadn't brought. Vivian recovered first, smoothing one hand along the table's edge like she was pressing a wrinkle out of the conversation itself. That's a modest ask for a man who fought this hard to get here. "I'm not fighting for ownership, Vivian. I'm fighting for a foothold. Those aren't the same thing, whatever you've been telling people they are." Losing my temper in this room would hand her exactly the photograph she'd wanted at that school fence and never gotten. "How generous of you." Her tone stayed pleasant, almost warm, the coldest kind of warm I'd heard from her yet, and I had heard a few by then. Though I do wonder how a man so committed to fatherhood managed to be entirely absent for 6 years, only reappearing once the boy in question turned out to have real prospects attached to his name. "I was told my son was dead. I grieved a stamped notice for 6 years, Vivian, and you know that better than anyone in this room." I felt my jaw tighten and made myself unclench it before I spoke again. "Don't stand there and call that absence. Call it what it actually was. That's your account. I understand grief invents its own narrative." Vivian turned, deliberately, toward Claire, drawing her into the frame the way a lawyer draws a witness toward a prepared question. But there are other accounts, aren't there, Claire? Accounts that suggest the timeline is a good deal less flattering than Mr. Mercer's version. Claire's hands were folded tight on the table, knuckles pale, and for one long second, I thought she might actually contradict her mother, might finally say the thing I'd been waiting 6 years to hear. Instead, she looked at me, not unkindly, and chose the safer road. I think we need to resolve exactly what happened before Theo returned. Before we talk about expanding access, Claire said. Careful, measured, a decision delivered like policy instead of feeling. Not to punish you, Daniel, to protect him. He's already confused about who left and why. I won't add more confusion until that's settled. That's not Vivian's position. That's yours. I said it quiet, not accusing, just naming the thing so it couldn't hide behind her mother's shadow anymore. You're choosing to keep me at a distance. Own that at least. Don't let her be the reason you get to hide behind. Claire's eyes flicked away, and something moved across her face that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite defiance. Some third thing I didn't have a name for yet. I am owning it. That's exactly what I'm doing right now, Daniel. I'm choosing caution. That's mine, not hers. Graham cleared his throat, the sound of a man about to say something he'd rehearsed more than once in the car on the way over. I'd like to be clear that Theo's stability matters more to me than my own position in this. But I also think it's fair to ask what minimal supervised contact becomes in 6 months or a year. These things tend to expand. They expand at the pace Theo sets. Graham, not the pace I want. That's the whole point of asking for minimal instead of maximum. I looked at him directly because he deserved that much. I'm not here to erase you. I watched you fix his lunch wrong with tape and I watched him love you anyway. That's not something I'm trying to compete with. Something in Graham's shoulders eased a fraction. Not trust exactly, but the absence of open hostility, which given the room we were sitting in, felt like its own small victory. Elena cut back in before Vivian could redirect the room again, her pen already tapping once against the folder like a small gavel. Given the modesty of the request, and given that biological paternity is now settled fact, I'm inclined to recommend the court approve limited supervised visitation, reviewed in 90 days. That's not custody. That's a beginning. A beginning built on an incomplete history, Vivian said, and her voice had shifted, gone from warm to precise, a woman reloading rather than retreating. I'd ask that any recommendation account for the full circumstances of Mr. Mercer's departure before this family 6 years ago. I don't believe those circumstances have been fairly examined. There's nothing to examine. I was overseas. I came back the moment I could, and there's a military record that says exactly when. I felt the old grief rise fast and had to breathe through it before I said something I'd regret in front of Elena's folder and everyone's careful faces. I didn't leave anyone. I was told there was nothing left to come back to. That's your recollection. Vivian's smile didn't move, though something behind her eyes had gone sharper, calculating something new. I understand Whitmore Memorial retains records from that period. Records that may offer a somewhat different account of contact that was made and declined at the time. I'd like those records reviewed before any expansion of access is finalized. I looked at Elena, who was already writing something down, her expression carefully neutral in the specific way professionals go neutral when they've just heard a threat dressed up as due diligence. What records? I asked, though some old cold part of me already suspected the shape of the answer before she gave it. The hospital's internal file from your son's birth week. I'm told there's a contemporaneous note regarding attempts to reach the father. Vivian folded her hands, satisfied, patient, a woman who had just replaced one weapon with a sharper one the moment the first had failed her. I believe a Mr. Kessler still has access to it. He was operations director at the time. I'll have him produce it for the next review. The room went quiet again, differently this time, and I felt the ground under the day's small, hard-won victory shift beneath me. The modest ask granted with one hand and something colder already being loaded into the other. Elena closed her folder, unhurried, unreadable. Then, we'll review that record at the next session, alongside the supervised visitation order. 90 days, Mr. Mercer. Small steps, properly documented, nothing anyone can later claim you took by force. 90 days. Somewhere across town, a 6-year-old was doing homework or arguing about Pluto, entirely unaware that a room full of adults had just spent an afternoon negotiating the terms of his own history, 3 floors above a title company he had never set foot in. I left that conference room having won exactly what I'd asked for, and somehow feeling like I'd handed Vivian the next round without meaning to. The paper in my pocket proved I was Theo's father. It did absolutely nothing to prove I hadn't, somehow, chosen to disappear from him anyway. And Vivian had just told the whole room exactly where she intended to go, looking for that proof next. Owen Kessler looked exactly like a man who had spent 30 years making bad news sound like weather, gray suit, gray tie, a leather folder held in both hands, like something he was protecting more than presenting. He introduced himself before Elena could do it for him. Owen Kessler. I was operations director at Whitmore Memorial during the period in question. Mrs. Whitmore asked me to bring the relevant file myself, given its sensitivity. Sensitive how? I asked, because the word already told me more than I wanted to know before he'd opened the folder. I'm not sure my son's birth week qualifies as sensitive to anyone but me. You'll understand in a moment, Mr. Mercer. He said my name carefully, neutrally, the way you'd handle a specimen you didn't want to contaminate with your own opinion of it. I'd rather you hear the record itself before we discuss what it means. Elena's pen stopped moving. Claire's hands, folded on the table since the moment Kessler sat down, went very still, and Graham leaned forward an inch, the posture of a man bracing to catch something before it hit the floor. Kessler opened the folder and read from a single typed page, unhurried, his voice flattening every word into the same careful register. Contact log, dated the night of the emergency delivery. Father reached by hospital staff regarding infant's condition and subsequent complications. Father acknowledged information provided. Father declined further identification or contact, citing personal circumstances and deployment obligations. No further contact attempted per Father's stated wishes. He closed the folder with the soft finality of a man closing a coffin lid. The room went quiet. Not like the silences before it. Heavier. Colder. The quiet that lands when a story you've told yourself for 6 years picks up a second author you never once invited into it. That never happened. I heard my own voice come out steadier than I felt, which was its own small miracle. Nobody contacted me that night. I was in transit. I didn't have a working phone for 4 days, and I've never in my life declined contact with my own son. I understand this is difficult to hear. Kessler's tone didn't shift a degree, sympathy delivered like a form letter. I wasn't personally present for the call. This reflects the log kept by the attending case coordinator at the time, a woman named Priya Deshmukh, who left the hospital's employ several years ago. Then, let's ask her. I looked at Elena, at Kessler, at anyone who might actually answer the question instead of deflecting it politely. Where's Priya Deshmukh now? I'd like to hear this from the person who supposedly made the call, not from a folder somebody else is holding. I'm afraid I don't have current contact information for former staff. Kessler said it the way you'd report a printer was out of toner. A minor administrative gap. Nothing personal in the shrug that came with it. I can request archival access, though these things take time through proper channels. I'd rather not promise a date I can't actually keep. How convenient. I felt the anger rising and forced it back down because Elena's warning from that morning's call was still ringing in my ears louder than my own pulse. A record nobody can verify from a woman nobody can find. That happens to say exactly what everyone in this room already wanted to believe about me. I understand the timing feels convenient to you. Kessler folded his hands on top of the folder, patient, unbothered, a man who had clearly survived worse accusations than mine across 3 decades of exactly this kind of meeting. I can only tell you what the hospital's records show. I have no stake in whether you find that comfortable, Mr. Mercer. I never have. Claire hadn't said a word since he'd started reading. I watched her instead of him, watched the way her shoulders had eased, just slightly, the tension she'd been carrying since the paternity result finally finding somewhere to set itself down. Claire. I said her name quiet, not accusing yet, just asking her to look at me instead of the folder. You know that isn't true. You know I never got a call like that. Tell them. She looked at me, and for one long second, something moved behind her eyes that looked almost like an apology trying to find its way out through 6 years of scar tissue. I don't know what I know anymore, Daniel. I was told you'd been reached. I was told you'd made your choice. I believed it because I had to believe something that week. That's not the same as this being true. No, it isn't. Her voice cracked, small, and she looked back down at her folded hands instead of at either of us. But it's consistent with what I was told at the time, by people I trusted more than I've apparently ever trusted you. I can't just dismiss that, because it's inconvenient for you now. Graham cleared his throat, careful, the sound of a man picking his moment with real strategy behind it. I think this changes the calculus considerably. If there's any credible record suggesting Daniel was reached and declined contact, that's directly relevant to how much access we're comfortable expanding. It's not credible. It's convenient. I turned to him, tired now, the anger burning down into something closer to exhaustion. You've spent this whole process worried about being made disposable, Graham. Doesn't it strike you as strange that the one piece of paper that solves that worry for you shows up exactly when you need it to? That landed harder than I meant it to. Graham's jaw tightened, and for a second I thought I'd made an enemy out of someone who'd been, at worst, a cautious neutral party up until that exact sentence. I'm not trying to solve anything for myself. His voice stayed level, but something underneath it had gone brittle. I'm trying to protect a 6-year-old from adults who keep rewriting his history every time new evidence shows up. That's not convenience, that's caution, and frankly, you'd do the same in my position. Elena finally spoke, cutting through before either of us could escalate further. I want to be precise about what this document can and cannot establish. It documents that the hospital's internal record contains this claim. It does not, on its own, prove that any actual call occurred, or that Mr. Mercer received it, or that he responded as described. Thank you. I said it too fast, too grateful, and Elena's look told me not to celebrate yet. That said, she turned back to Kessler. Professional, unreadable. Given that this record now exists and has been formally entered, I can't in good conscience recommend expanding access beyond the current 90-day supervised arrangement until its provenance is independently verified. I'm sorry, Mr. Mercer. That's the honest, careful answer, not the comfortable one, and I promised you honest a long time before I promised you comfortable. So, nothing changes, except now everyone in this room has a reason to believe I'm the man who walked away, instead of the man they weren't quite sure about yet. I said it flat, not to anyone in particular, watching the room rearrange itself around a story that hadn't existed an hour ago, and now apparently outweighed 6 years of my actual memory. Kessler gathered his folder with the unhurried care of a man who considered the meeting a success, though nothing in his face admitted it outright. I understand this outcome isn't what you hoped for, Mr. Mercer. I take no pleasure in it. My only interest is an accurate record. Your only interest is a closed file. I stood because sitting there any longer felt like agreeing to something I hadn't actually agreed to. That log has a date and a time on it. A specific night. I want that exact date and time in writing. Because unlike your missing coordinator, I can actually prove where I was standing on any given hour of that week. For the first time, something flickered behind Kessler's composure. Brief, controlled, gone almost before I caught it. I'll have the exact timestamp forwarded to Ms. Ruiz. I don't anticipate it will change anything, but I have no objection to you reviewing it. He left first, unhurried. Vivian's absence from the room somehow louder than her presence would have been. A woman who'd learned exactly how to win a round without once showing up to watch it happen. Claire caught me in the hallway afterward, alone. Graham already gone ahead to bring the car around, her heels loud against the tile in a way that told me she'd hurry to catch me before I reached the elevator. I didn't say I believed it, she said, quiet, urgent, like she needed me to hear that part. Before I walked away angry at her, too. I said I couldn't dismiss it. That's not the same thing, Daniel. It felt the same from where I was sitting. I said it low, tired rather than cruel. You had a chance to just say the plain truth, that I never got a call, and you gave them a legal technicality instead. I needed you in there, Claire, not a careful non-answer. She didn't have anything to say to that, and I didn't wait around for her to find something. I drove home turning that timestamp over and over in my head, certain of exactly one thing in a day that had taken almost everything else away from me. Whatever night Kessler's folder claimed I was standing in a hospital hallway declining my own son, I had been somewhere else entirely. And somewhere else leaves a trail if you know how to go looking for it. I called Elena from the truck before I'd even reached the highway, and she picked up on the second ring like she'd been expecting exactly this call. I need my old service records, Elena. Leave requests, travel orders, whatever the Army keeps on file for a man moving through 4 countries in 96 hours. That's a formal request through the National Personnel Records Center, not a phone call, and it can take weeks even when it's routine. She let the silence sit a second before continuing. I already started the paperwork this afternoon, the moment Kessler said the word coordinator instead of a name I could actually call myself. You didn't wait for me to ask. I've watched enough of these meetings to know which document usually beats which lie, Mr. Mercer. A timestamp is either true or it isn't. And unlike memory, the Army doesn't grieve. It just keeps a log. Tessa was waiting up when I got back to the garage, sitting on the hood of a customer's sedan with 2 coffees gone cold beside her. She didn't ask how it went, because my face had apparently become an open book to everyone in my life, except the people actually deciding my son's future. That bad. Worse. They found a piece of paper that says I'm the villain, and everyone in that room wanted badly enough to believe it that nobody asked who actually wrote it. I sat down next to her on the cold hood, grateful not to be alone with it. I've got a records request in with the army now. If I was where I know I was, there's a way to prove it. It's just going to take longer than I have patience for. Tessa handed me the cold coffee anyway, because apparently that was still better than nothing. Then we wait with bad patience together, she said. You didn't lose today, Daniel. You just found out exactly how far she's willing to reach to keep winning. Now you know the shape of the next fight instead of guessing at it in the dark. The Fairmont Branch Library ran a Thursday maker program in a back room lined with plastic bins, and my supervised hour landed square in the middle of it. Claire parked in a chair by the door with a book she wasn't reading. Theo had a birdhouse kit spread across the table when I walked in. Dowels and pre-cut planks and a little bag of nails sized for kid hands. And he looked up at me for exactly 1 second before his attention snapped back to the instructions. Graham, this part doesn't match the picture. He said it without preamble, already reaching for the man 2 seats down, who set aside his own coffee and slid over, like he'd been waiting for the summons his whole afternoon. Something small and ugly moved through my chest. Fast, familiar, the same feeling I used to get watching another mechanic get handed the interesting job while I coiled hoses in the back. I recognized it for what it was and made myself sit with it instead of acting on it. Let's see. Graham turned the instruction sheet 90 degrees. Methodical. Patient. The voice of a man who had clearly done this exact kit with this exact kid before. Ah, you've got panel C and panel D mixed up. Easy fix. See the notch here versus here? Theo squinted at the 2 boards like they'd personally betrayed him. They look the same. They're not, though. Panel C's notch is off center. That's how you know which side faces the roof. Graham demonstrated, unhurried, and Theo watched with the total focus he gave anything mechanical. I stayed where I was, 2 seats back, hands loose on the table, doing absolutely nothing, which took considerably more effort than it should have for a man whose entire professional life was fixing things other people had given up on. Claire glanced over from her chair by the door, just once, quick and assessing, the way you'd check a stove burner you weren't sure you'd turned off. I caught the look and understood exactly what she was watching for. Whether I'd insert myself, whether I'd make this about me instead of her son's birdhouse. I didn't. It cost me something real to sit there watching Graham get it right. Watching Theo lean into an ease and trust that 6 years of daily proximity had built brick by brick. I'd decided in the truck on the drive over that today wasn't going to be the day I tried to win a competition nobody had actually invited me to enter, no matter how badly some old, stubborn part of me wanted to. Theo hammered the first nail crooked, swore under his breath in a way that made Graham's eyebrows twitch, and yanked it back out with a determined scowl that was, unmistakably, entirely mine. I'd made that exact face at that exact angle 1,000 times, under 1,000 stubborn bolts, and it was strange, watching genetics show up in a scowl instead of a photograph. Try angling the nail away from you a little before the first tap, Graham said. Gentle, corrective, the voice of a man who coached kids through minor failures for a living and never once let his patience crack. Sets the path straighter. It was good advice. It was also, I noticed, advice that assumed Theo would get it right the first time if he just followed instructions carefully enough, which wasn't how Theo actually operated, as far as I'd learned him. Theo learned by breaking something first and asking why after. Same as I always had, same as my father before me, apparently. He tried the angled tap. It went in straighter, but he still hit his thumb on the follow-through, hissed through his teeth, and shook his hand out with the exaggerated drama of a kid who wanted sympathy more than he wanted the pain acknowledged. You're bleeding, Graham said, already reaching for the little first aid kit he'd apparently brought along. Because of course he had. Because Graham was a man who arrived at a library craft table prepared for minor surgery if it came to that. I'm not bleeding. It's just red. Theo inspected his own thumb with total confidence in his diagnosis, then looked past Graham, past the first aid kit, straight at me for the first time since I'd sat down. Daniel, does it look bleeding to you, or just mad? I leaned in, careful not to make more of the invitation than it was, and looked at the thumb the way I'd look at a customer's engine, honest and unimpressed by drama. Just mad. Give it a second, it'll calm down. You clipped the nail head, not the meat. See? Theo said it to Graham, vindicated, already shaking off the offered bandage. Told you it wasn't bleeding. Graham's mouth did something complicated, not quite annoyed, not quite amused, the expression of a man recalibrating in real time. Fair enough, Graham said, and put the kit away without further comment, which I noted and respected more than I expected to. A lesser man would have pushed the bandage anyway, just to reassert the point. Theo went back to the birdhouse, and while he dug through the nail bag for a longer one, Graham leaned back in his chair and looked at me for the first time all session, not hostile, just measuring. You're doing better than I expected today, he said, quiet, pitched under the noise of the room so Theo wouldn't catch it over his own hammering. I half thought you'd try to take over the second he asked me instead of you. Would have been easy to. Old habit, wanting to be the guy who knows the answer. I kept my eyes on Theo, not Graham, because this felt like the kind of conversation that went better sideways than face on. Didn't seem worth winning today at his expense. No. Graham turned his coffee cup a quarter turn, considering that longer than the sentence probably deserved. It wouldn't have been. I appreciate you seeing that actually, more than I expected to. I went back to watching, the crooked nail still sitting there half-hammered like a small monument to the fact that nobody in this room needed me to fix anything right now, and found I didn't entirely mind the monument. Why aren't you helping? Theo said suddenly, not looking up from the roof panel, aiming the question sideways at me like he'd been building up to it the whole session. You know how to fix stuff. You said so. You're just sitting there. Graham's already helping. Seemed rude to jump in on top of him. It came out easy, like the answer cost me nothing, which was a small lie I was getting better at telling by the week. Two guys giving you different instructions at the same time just makes the birdhouse worse, not better. Ask any mechanic who's ever had a second guy climb under the same car. That's a weird reason. He hammered another nail, straighter this time, and didn't look up. Mom says you fix engines other people already gave up on fixing. Seems like you'd want to fix my birdhouse too. I want a lot of things, bud. Doesn't mean I get to just take them because I want them, no matter how much I want them. I said it lighter than it felt, because the honest version of that sentence would have unraveled something in my chest I wasn't ready to show him at a library craft table. Graham was here first today. That matters. Theo considered that, hammer paused midair, weighing it against whatever internal ledger he kept for adult behavior that made sense versus adult behavior that was just noise. That's actually kind of a good reason, he said finally, grudging, the same verdict he'd handed the fence line boundary weeks earlier. Most of my good reasons are like that. Boring on the outside. That got the smallest curl of a smile out of him. Gone fast, and he went back to hammering with new focus. Like something had settled that he hadn't planned to let settle. The birdhouse came together slowly, Graham's steady corrections, and Theo's stubborn trial and error building something crooked, but genuinely his own, and near the end, without any ceremony at all, Theo slid the leftover bag of nails across the table toward me. Hold these. I need both hands for the roof. It wasn't a big ask. It wasn't even really about me, but it was the first thing all afternoon he'd handed me without being prompted. And I took the little bag like it weighed considerably more than a bag of nails actually does. Claire watched that exchange too, I noticed. Her book still closed in her lap, and her expression when I glanced over wasn't quite approval, but it wasn't the wary vigilance from earlier either. It looked almost like a woman doing new math on an old, settled equation. My phone buzzed in my pocket just as Theo hammered the last nail home, crooked roof and all, grinning at his own lopsided creation like it was a cathedral. I didn't check it until the session ended, and Claire was walking him toward the door, one hand light on his shoulder. It was an email from Elena, 3 lines long, the kind of 3 lines that can rearrange an entire week. Complete service record received from NPRC. Leave request dated the 14th. Travel orders confirmed transit through 3 connecting bases. Arrival stamp at Belhaven International the 18th. Call me tonight. I stood there in the library parking lot, doing the math I already half knew by heart. 4 days of transit, a date on Kessler's contact log that fell squarely inside a window when I hadn't set foot on American soil, let alone stood in a hospital hallway declining to know my own son, the way that folder claimed I had, in a voice steady enough to make a room full of careful adults believe it. I called Elena from the parking lot before I'd even started the truck, and she answered, like she'd been sitting with the phone in her hand, waiting for me to see the email. You saw it. I saw it. Tell me I'm reading it right, Elena. Tell me that date means exactly what I think it means, because I've read it 4 times already. It means you were somewhere over the Atlantic, or sitting in a connecting terminal in Ramstein, on the exact night Kessler's log says a hospital case coordinator sat you down, and you calmly declined to know your own son. So, it's done. We take this back to the review, and it's just done. I felt a flicker of hope I didn't quite trust yet, some early relative of the real thing I'd learned the hard way not to get ahead of. It's not nothing, Daniel, but it's not automatically done either. Elena's voice stayed careful, the same careful that had kept me from making a dozen mistakes already. A travel record proves where your body was. It doesn't, by itself, prove who wrote that log or why. Kessler will have an answer ready. He always does. Then we make him give it in the room, in front of everyone who believed his coordinator over me. I pulled out of the library lot slower than I meant to, hands steadier on the wheel than they had any right to be. I want that meeting as soon as you can get it scheduled. I'll call his office in the morning. Get some sleep tonight, if you can manage it." She paused, and when she spoke again, there was something almost gentle underneath the professional flatness. "You did the hard part already, Mr. Mercer. You sat still today and let a boy choose someone else to trust, and you did it without breaking anything." A short silence then, quieter. "That matters more than this timestamp does, in the long run." For the first time since that folder had opened in front of me, I had something in my hand instead of just something in my memory. And it felt less like triumph than like finally being handed a wrench for a bolt I'd been trying to turn with my bare fingers for 2 straight weeks. Elena got the follow-up review scheduled inside 4 days, faster than I'd expected from a system that usually moved like cold syrup, and I understood why the moment I saw Kessler's face when he walked in and clocked the folder under my arm. Same conference room, same bad coffee, same long table, but the seating had shifted without anyone announcing it. Kessler sat a little farther from Vivian this time. Small thing. I noticed it anyway, the way you notice a belt starting to slip before it actually breaks. Tessa had offered to come sit in the hallway that morning, just to be near, and I'd told her no, mostly because I needed to walk into that room believing I could do this without anyone holding my hand through it. "I'll keep this simple," I said, before anyone else could set the room's tone for me. I slid the NPRC printout across the table, careful, unhurried, the way you hand over a diagnostic instead of an accusation. My complete service and travel record for the week in question. Leave request, transit orders, arrival stamp. Every hour of that week accounted for. Elena picked it up first, scanned it, then passed it to Kessler without comment, her face giving away nothing at all. "The date on your contact log is the 15th. Mr. Mercer's arrival stamp at Belhaven International is the 18th. He was in transit through 3 connecting bases on the date your record claims he was reached and declined contact." The room held its breath, gone tight and expectant, right before somebody has to admit something they'd rather not. I watched Kessler read the printout twice, unhurried, giving nothing away. A man doing math he'd clearly already half expected to have to do eventually. "This is a discrepancy worth examining," he said finally, setting the page down with the careful neutrality of a surgeon setting down an instrument. "I want to be clear that I'm not disputing your travel record, Mr. Mercer. I have no reason to." "Good. Then we agree the call in that log never happened the way it's written." I said it small and even, holding down every urge to turn it into the victory lap that some tired, furious part of me had wanted so badly it almost won. "I'm not asking anyone in this room to admit to a conspiracy. I'm asking for one specific false claim to be corrected, nothing more than that. That's a fair and reasonable request." Kessler folded his hands and his posture shifted, quietly recalibrating, a man abandoning one defensible position for the next one down the line. "Though I'd note the log doesn't specify that hospital staff reached you directly by phone. It states only that the information was conveyed and declined." "Conveyed how then? By whom?" Elena's question landed flat and precise. The exact question I'd been about to ask myself. "I believe on review that the notation likely reflects information relayed through the mother at the time, rather than direct contact with Mr. Mercer." Kessler said it the way you'd report a clerical footnote, mild, unremarkable, dropping it into the room like it weighed nothing at all. Ms. Whitmore would have been the hospital's primary point of contact during that period, given the father's unavailability. Every head in the room turned toward Claire at once, and I watched her go pale in real time, the sudden whiteness of someone realizing the ground under her had just been sold out from underneath her by a man she'd trusted to keep it solid. "That's not..." Claire's voice cracked on the second word. "That's not what happened. I never told anyone he declined contact. I never said that to a single person at that hospital. I'm not suggesting deliberate misrepresentation, Ms. Whitmore." Kessler's tone stayed smooth, apologetic in shape without being apologetic in substance. "Only that the coordinator's notation may have summarized information she received secondhand, imperfectly, during an extremely difficult night for everyone involved." "You're saying I lied." Claire's hands had gone flat on the table, pressing down like she needed the wood to hold her up. "That's what you're actually saying, without saying it. So it lands on me, instead of on whatever your coordinator actually wrote 6 years ago." "I'm saying the record is imperfect, and imperfect records have imperfect sources." Kessler didn't blink. He didn't apologize either. He just sat there, absorbing her shock like weather. A man who had clearly done this exact maneuver before and knew precisely how long the storm would take to pass. I watched something break behind Claire's eyes. Not confession, not yet, but the hairline crack that opens in a person the first time they realize the people protecting them will spend them without a second thought if it saves the protector a single uncomfortable minute. That's convenient. I said it quiet, not to score a point off her humiliation, but because somebody needed to name what had just happened out loud. 2 weeks ago, your note said I refused contact. Now that the timeline breaks, suddenly it was Claire's word all along. Funny how the story adjusts itself exactly enough to survive. I'm not adjusting anything, Mr. Mercer. I'm clarifying an ambiguous notation in light of new information you yourself provided. Kessler's composure didn't crack, but his eyes had gone very still. A man watching his own careful architecture take on water faster than he wanted to admit in front of witnesses. Elena closed her folder, done letting the room run itself for a moment. For the record, this note has now lost its standing as a neutral, credible source. It cannot establish that Mr. Mercer was contacted, and its account of who said what to whom has changed twice in 2 meetings. I won't weigh it further without independent corroboration. 2 of the neutral reviewers wrote that down. I watched them do it, and understood that a record losing its authority was not the same as me gaining any, only the ground going quiet enough that the next true thing might finally be heard over the noise. A reasonable position, Kessler said, already reaching for his own folder, already retreating toward the door with the unhurried calm of a man who considered damage control complete rather than failed. I have nothing further to add today. He left first again, same as before, and this time Vivian didn't stay long after him either, gathering her things with brisk, controlled movements, sparing Claire exactly one look on her way out that I couldn't fully read, but that made Claire flinch anyway. Graham reached over and put a hand on Claire's shoulder, careful, and she let him. Though she didn't lean into it the way I'd have expected from a woman who'd just been publicly thrown to a wolf by her own family's chosen professional. Graham's face had its own quiet arithmetic running behind it, I noticed. The careful stillness of a man who'd just watched an ally he trusted casually sacrifice the mother of the boy he loved without so much as a flinch of hesitation. Elena waited until the room had mostly cleared before sliding one more page across the table to me, a printout of her own. Something she'd clearly been saving for exactly this moment. One more thing, while everyone's still processing the first thing. I found a transfer record. Transfer to where? My pulse picked up even after everything else the morning had already cost me. Some old stubborn hope refusing to stay buried, no matter how many times I told it to. A pediatric intake at Bellhaven Children's Receiving Facility, dated within the same 48-hour window as your son's birth. Infant male, family name Whitmore, no father listed on the intake form. Elena tapped the page. Precise. I can't yet confirm it's your son. I can confirm a living infant matching that description left one hospital and arrived at another, the same week you were told there was nothing left to bury. The room tilted slightly, or maybe that was just me. The floor of 6 years of grief shifting under a single administrative sentence, delivered as flatly as a weather report. He was alive. He left that hospital alive. I can't prove that's Theo yet. I want to be careful about that. Elena's voice gentled just slightly, the first real softness I'd heard from her since we'd met above that dry cleaner weeks ago. But it's a lawful next thread, and it leads somewhere a false hospital note can't follow you. Somebody at that receiving facility signed for that infant. Somebody remembers. I sat there a long moment with both pages in front of me, one that had just collapsed under its own weight, and one that had just opened a door I hadn't known existed that morning. Something in me understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that the fight had just changed shape entirely, from proving I was innocent to proving what had actually happened to a living child. Claire was still sitting across the table when I looked up, Graham's hand still on her shoulder, her eyes fixed on some point past my head, like she was doing math she didn't want to finish out loud in front of either of us. Claire. I kept my voice quiet, not triumphant, because there was nothing left in me that wanted to win this particular moment off her back. He threw you under a bus he built himself, in front of your whole family, without blinking. I need you to actually sit with that before you decide who you're protecting next. She didn't answer right away. When she finally looked at me, her whole face had shifted from 6 years of careful, practiced certainty into something rawer and far less sure of itself. I don't know what I'm protecting anymore, Daniel. I used to know exactly. I don't anymore. Her voice barely carried past the table, and Graham's hand on her shoulder tightened, uncertain now himself. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't even close to one. But it was the first true sentence I'd heard her say since the playground. Unscripted. The kind of thing that slips out before a person remembers they're supposed to be careful. I gathered both pages, the collapse note and the new transfer record, and left her sitting there with Graham. Because pushing further today would have cost more than it earned, and I was learning which fights were actually worth winning in the moment. I drove home that evening, turning her sentence over like a part I couldn't quite identify yet, certain only that something in the machine had finally started to come loose, one bolt at a time, the way things usually come apart before they can be rebuilt honestly. Elena called once more before I reached the garage, brief and businesslike, already 3 steps ahead of me the way she'd been since that first afternoon above the dry cleaner. I'm going to try to locate whoever signed that intake form. Discreetly. No promises on timeline. Whatever you need from me, you've got it. I meant it more completely than I'd meant almost anything in 6 years. Just tell me where to point myself next, Elena. I'm done waiting for other people's paperwork to decide what happens to my son. Then point yourself at Patience for a few more days, she said, not unkindly. You did good work today, Mr. Mercer. You let the truth do the heavy lifting instead of your temper. Don't lose that discipline now that the doors finally cracked open. Helen Cho lived in a small house on the quiet end of Larkspur Street, the kind of yard with too many wind chimes and a welcome mat that had clearly meant it once, and she opened the door only as far as the chain would allow when Elena knocked. I already told the other man I have nothing to say. Her voice shook slightly, an older woman's voice carrying something younger and more frightened underneath it. Whatever this is, I'm retired. I signed things a long time ago that aren't my business to discuss anymore. What other man? I asked, before Elena could ease into her careful introduction. And my tone must have carried more urgency than I meant, because Helen's eyes flicked to me and narrowed with fresh suspicion. Owen Kessler called me 2 days ago. She said the name like it tasted bad in her mouth. Reminded me my pension runs through a hospital foundation that could review old personnel files if certain retired staff started. And I'm quoting him. Reopening settled matters. I felt something cold settle in my gut that had nothing to do with the autumn wind coming off the porch. 2 days ago was the same week Elena had started asking around about who signed that intake form, which meant somebody inside that system had noticed the question before we'd even found the answer, and moved fast enough to get to Helen before we did, a speed that told me exactly how much this particular thread scared them. I'm not here to threaten your pension, Mrs. Cho. I'm not here to threaten anything. My voice came out as level as I could manage, my own pulse hammering under it. My name's Daniel Mercer. I think you might have signed for my son the night he was born. I just want to know if he was alive when he left that hospital. Helen went very still behind the chain, and for a long moment I thought she was going to close the door on us entirely, the way she'd probably closed it on plenty of reporters and lawyers and curious strangers over however many years this fear had been living in her chest. Mercer. She said the name slow, testing it, and something behind her eyes shifted, softened, the quiet give of a person who has been waiting a long time for a question they could finally answer honestly. You're the father. The one they told was dead. That's me. I've been trying to find out what actually happened to him for months now, Mrs. Cho, and you're the first person who's looked at me like the answer might actually matter to you too. She unhooked the chain without another word and stepped back to let us in, hands trembling slightly as she gestured us toward a small kitchen table cluttered with mail she clearly hadn't gotten around to sorting. I need you to understand something before I say anything else. Helen sat across from us, hands wrapped around a mug of tea gone cold, staring at it instead of at either of us. I can tell you what I saw. I cannot tell you what happened after, or who decided what, or why. I was a junior nurse. I saw pieces, not the whole picture. Pieces are more than I've had in 6 years. I said it as gently as I could, and Elena, beside me, stayed quiet, letting the room belong to Helen instead of turning it into a deposition. Your son was born with a heart defect. Serious. The kind that needs surgery within days, not weeks, at a facility with pediatric cardiac capability, which Whitmore Memorial simply didn't have at the time. Helen's voice steadied slightly as she found the professional cadence of a story she'd clearly told herself 100 times in private, just never out loud to the one person who needed to hear it. He was alive. I heard my own voice crack on the words, 6 years of buried grief cracking with it. He was actually alive. He was alive. And he was in real danger, and the transfer to a facility that could operate on him needed to happen within hours. Helen looked up at me then, finally, eyes wet. Vivian Whitmore was already at the hospital. I don't know how she got there so fast, But by the time I understood what was happening, she was the one giving instructions, not the doctors. What kind of instructions exactly? I need the actual words she used if you can still remember them after all this time. She told the attending she'd cover the transfer and the surgical costs personally through the family foundation on the condition it happened immediately and quietly under the mother's maiden name. Helen's hands tightened around the mug. I remember thinking it was strange, using a different name for an emergency transfer, but nobody argues with the woman writing the check when a baby's heart is failing. And Claire. I made myself say her name steady, though it cost me more than I expected. What did Claire do while all this was happening around her? Your wife was in pieces, Mr. Mercer. I want you to understand that clearly before anything else. Helen's voice sharpened slightly, protective of a memory that clearly still troubled her. She'd just given birth. She was told her son might die on the table, and her own mother was standing over her making decisions faster than she could process them. I heard part of what Vivian told her, through the curtain, while I was documenting vitals. Something about how this was the only way to guarantee the specialists, the only way to protect the baby's future. That Claire needed to trust her, and let the family handle the rest properly this time. Whatever properly was supposed to mean to a woman who'd just given birth in terror. Helen shook her head slowly. I didn't understand the full weight of it then. I understand more of it now looking back than I did standing right there. Handle the rest properly. I repeated it flat, tasting the phrase Vivian had apparently used to describe erasing me from my own son's life while I was still 4 days from landing on American soil, meaning cut me out entirely. I can't tell you what was meant by it. I can only tell you what I heard, and I heard fear, Mr. Mercer. Real fear, from a young mother who'd just been told her baby might not survive the night. Helen's eyes held mine, steady now despite the tremor still in her hands. I don't think Claire Whitmore was capable of arguing with anyone about anything in that room. I think she was drowning, and her mother threw her a rope with strings attached to it. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling the shape of the story shift under me again. The same way it had shifted in that conference room when Kessler's note collapsed and something worse and more human had opened up underneath it. Vivian hadn't started this out of cruelty for its own sake. She'd started it in a genuine emergency, terrified for a dying infant, and made a choice that happened to also solve a problem she'd wanted solved for years. That didn't make it forgivable. It made it somehow worse in a different way. Because a monster acting purely from cruelty was almost easier to hate cleanly than a frightened, controlling woman who'd used a real crisis as cover for a decision she'd wanted to make anyway. What happened to him after the transfer? Do you know that much at least? Even a fragment would be more than I have right now. I know the surgery happened, and I know it went well, because word travels in hospitals even after a patient's gone to another facility. I heard secondhand that the infant recovered fully within the first year. Helen wiped at her eyes with the back of one hand, embarrassed by her own tears in a way that made them land harder for me, not softer. I've thought about that baby for 6 years, Mr. Mercer. I never knew his name until just now. Theo. I said it quiet, offering it to her like something fragile. His name is Theo. He's 6 now. He likes taking things apart more than putting them back together. Theo. She tried the name out like a small act of penance. Quiet, careful, like handling something that might still break. I should have said something years ago. I told myself it wasn't my place, that I only saw fragments, that speaking up could cost me my job and maybe hurt the child somehow, though I could never quite explain to myself how. Fear doesn't need good logic. It just needs enough of a reason to keep your mouth shut. You're saying something now. That's what actually matters to me. I meant it, though some old furious part of me wanted to ask why now had taken 6 years to arrive. I didn't ask it. She'd given me more today than anyone else had given me in this entire fight, and I wasn't going to spend it punishing her for the years before. Elena finally spoke, careful, professional, laying the next question down like a bridge instead of a trap. Mrs. Cho, would you be willing to put any of this in a written statement? Not today. When you're ready. It would matter a great deal, and I'd make certain it stayed as protected as the law allows. Helen was quiet a long moment, turning her cold tea in slow circles. Kessler already tried to frighten me out of saying anything. I suppose the only thing worse than being frightened into silence is staying silent because I let him win that easily. She looked at me, something resolved settling into her face. Yes, I'll write it down. Properly, this time. With my name on it. We left her house a little after 4, the light already going golden low over Larkspur Street, and I sat in Elena's car a long while before either of us spoke. replaying Vivian's words through Helen's memory. Let me handle the rest properly. 6 years of grief reorganizing itself around a sentence I hadn't even been in the room to hear. There's one more thing you should know before you build a whole new picture of Vivian out of this, Elena said finally, pulling a folder from her bag, the same careful weight in her voice she used whenever she was about to hand me something that would hurt. I pulled the divorce filing while we were waiting on Helen's contact information, mostly out of habit. I wasn't expecting it to matter this much until just now. And Claire filed 7 months after Theo's birth, uncontested, standard language, declaring no living child of the marriage, filed and signed in her own hand, not her mother's. Elena set the page in front of me, and I stared at the date printed at the top like it might rearrange itself into something less damning if I looked hard enough. 7 months, Daniel. Theo's surgery, by Helen's account, happened and succeeded within the first weeks. Whatever coercion existed the night of the emergency, it had long since passed by the time Claire signed that filing. I looked at the date a long time, feeling something that wasn't quite the same anger I'd carried since the playground, colder and more specific now, aimed at a woman who'd had months to change course and hadn't. So the first lie was Vivian's, born out of real panic in a room I wasn't in. I said it slow, working it out loud because I needed to hear the shape of it. But the second one, the one that lasted 6 years, the one that let me grieve a death on paper while my child was alive, that one belongs to Claire, alone, on purpose, long after anyone could still call it fear. Elena didn't correct me. She let the silence sit there, honest and unhelpful, and exactly what the moment required, while the light kept fading gold over a street I'd probably never have found without a frightened woman finally deciding 6 years of silence was long enough. What do I do with this? I asked finally, when the silence had stretched past what either of us could comfortably hold. Vivian, I can almost understand. God help me. Claire, I don't know how to hold anymore. You don't have to decide that tonight. Elena started the engine, unhurried, giving me the same careful distance she'd given Helen all afternoon. You take Helen's account, you take this filing, and you take it to Claire directly. Let her explain the 7 months, not her mother, her. And if she can't, then you'll know something you didn't know this morning, and you'll have earned the right to act on it honestly, instead of guessing in the dark the way you have been since that playground. Elena pulled away from the curb, and Larkspur Street slid past the window, ordinary and quiet, utterly indifferent to the 6 years it had just helped me finally understand. Claire agreed to meet me alone. No Vivian, no Graham, just Elena's office above the dry cleaner and the brittle quiet of 2 people who used to know each other's coffee order sitting across a desk that wasn't built for this kind of conversation. You talked to Helen Cho. She said it before I'd even sat down, flat, already bracing. Elena told me you would eventually. I've been expecting this conversation for longer than I want to admit. Then you know what she told me. I set the folder on the desk between us, unopened, because I didn't need to read it at her. I'd already memorized every line. The transfer. Your mother giving instructions instead of the doctor's. What she said to you through that curtain. Claire's hands went to the edge of the desk, gripping it the way she'd gripped the conference table weeks earlier, except there was no Kessler here to hide behind this time. No folder of somebody else's manufacture. Just her own 6 years laid out between us. I was terrified, Daniel. Her voice came out low, stripped of the careful composure she usually wore like armor. They told me his heart might stop before they even got him stable enough to move. My mother was the only person in that room who seemed to know what to do, and I was in no state to argue with anyone about anything. I believe you. I believe every word of that part. I got it out as gently as I could and still say the thing that needed saying. I don't believe it explains the next 6 years, Claire. Theo's surgery succeeded within weeks. You filed for divorce 7 months later, declaring no living child of the marriage. That's not panic anymore. That's a choice. Made with a clear head, long after anyone could still call it fear. She flinched like I'd actually touched her, and for a moment I thought she might simply refuse to answer, retreat into the same careful non-answers that had cost her so much credibility in that conference room with Kessler. You're right. It came out small, almost inaudible, and then steadier, like she'd decided admitting it plainly cost less than continuing to dodge it. The fear was real that first week. After that, it was easier. Theo was thriving. My mother was paying for everything. I had a story that let me keep him and keep moving forward without constantly explaining a dead husband who wasn't actually dead. Easier for you. I said it without heat, just naming the shape of it. What about easier for me? 6 years grieving a son I was told was ashes. What about easier for him? Growing up believing his father chose to disappear before he was even born. Do you know what it's like? Hearing a doctor say the words "might not survive the night" about something you held for the first time 9 hours earlier? Her voice had gone somewhere far away, back inside a room I hadn't been allowed into. I couldn't feel my own hands. My mother put a pen in front of me and I signed whatever she told me to sign, and I remember being grateful, actually grateful, that somebody else was making the decisions. I'm not asking you to relive it to punish yourself. I'm asking because I never got to know any of it happened. I built 6 years of grief on a lie I never once got to question, Claire. And you built 6 years of a whole life on the other side of the same lie. I know what I took from both of you. I've known it every single day, Daniel, in ways you can't imagine unless you've had to look your own son in the eye every morning knowing the truth he doesn't. Her composure cracked further, tears standing in her eyes now, unshed but close. That doesn't mean I know how to undo it without losing the only thing I actually managed to hold onto through all of it. Which is, I asked it quiet, giving her room to actually answer instead of deflect the way she'd deflected everyone for 6 straight years. Control. My own life. A version of motherhood where I got to decide the story instead of having it decided for me by a mother who's been deciding my life since I was younger than Theo is now. She said it fast, almost defensive, and then, exactly like I remembered from our marriage, the words kept coming, sliding sideways into logistics the moment the real feeling got too close to the surface. His pediatrician switch happens in the spring anyway. There's a whole intake process, and the school would need updated emergency contact forms regardless of any of this. And Graham's already spoken to a family therapist about how to handle a transition period properly. We've thought this through carefully. It's not like we're just reacting to you showing up out of nowhere and… Claire. I said her name quiet, but it stopped the flood of paperwork logic dead in its tracks. You're doing the thing you used to do. When something hurt too much to sit with, you'd start managing schedules instead of feeling anything. I used to think it was almost funny, back when we were married. It's not funny anymore. It's how I know exactly how much this is costing you to say out loud. She stared at me a long moment, something raw moving under her composure, caught between offense and recognition. I forgot you noticed things like that. I notice everything about you, Claire. That's never been the problem between us. I let that sit a second before pulling us both back to the actual point. I'm not here demanding custody. I'm not here to take him from you. I'm asking for one thing, and it's smaller than you're probably braced for. What? She said it warily, like she already suspected the answer would cost her something she wasn't ready to hand over. Tell him the truth. Not all of it, not the parts that would frighten a 6-year-old, but the actual shape of it in language he can hold. That his father didn't leave. That a mistake got made during a scary night and it turned into a story that stayed too long. I kept my eyes steady on hers. He deserves that much from you before he hears it secondhand from someone with worse intentions than mine. Claire was quiet a long time, turning something over that I couldn't see the shape of yet. I need to be the one who tells him, not you, not a lawyer, not a court order forcing my hand on a timeline that isn't mine. I'm not asking to be the one who tells him. I'm asking you to actually do it, on whatever timeline is honest, instead of managing it into something that protects you more than it helps him. That's not fair. Everything I've done to protect him. Her voice sharpened, old defensiveness reasserting itself now that the raw moment had passed. You don't get to stand there with 6 years of righteous grief and tell me my protection doesn't count for anything just because it also happened to protect me. I'm not saying it doesn't count. I'm saying it isn't the same as truth. And he's old enough now to start telling the difference between the two, whether either of us is ready for that or not. She didn't answer that directly. Instead, she looked down at her hands, and when she spoke again, her voice had gone careful in a new way, the sound of someone choosing words around something she wasn't ready to say plainly yet. My mother thinks I should consider moving, somewhere outside Belhaven, at least for a while, until things settle. A fresh environment for Theo, away from all of this, the reviews and the meetings, and now apparently a retired nurse with a written statement. Something cold moved through my chest, fast and sharp. A familiar dread I'd hoped I was done feeling. Consider it, or you're actually considering it. Those are two very different sentences, Claire. I'm considering it. Claire met my eyes then, and there was no apology in it, only a kind of tired, frightened resolve that scared me more than open hostility would have. Not because she's ordering me to, whatever you want to believe about that. Because some mornings, the idea of a place where nobody's investigating my worst decision sounds like the only peace I've had in 6 years. Claire, if you move him now, in the middle of all of this, it stops looking like healing and starts looking like removing him from a father who finally has proof he never abandoned anyone. I know how it looks. I'm asking you to trust for once that I might actually be thinking about what's best for him and not just what's convenient for me or my mother. She stood, gathering her coat, the conversation clearly closing whether I was ready for it to or not. I haven't decided anything yet, Daniel. I need you to hear that part too, not just the part that scares you. I watched her go, coat pulled tight, shoulders set like a woman carrying a decision she hadn't fully made but was already halfway toward anyway. I sat in Elena's borrowed chair a long time after the door closed, turning the whole conversation over like a part I couldn't quite get seated right, no matter which angle I tried it from. She'd admitted the coercion. She'd admitted the years of choice on top of it, plainly, without Vivian in the room to hide behind, or Kessler's folder to blame instead. She hadn't promised me the one thing I'd actually walked in there needing, which was time, unhurried and ordinary, for a boy who'd already lost enough of it to adults making decisions in rooms he wasn't allowed into. I called Elena from the truck, because some fights apparently only ever ended with me in this same seat, phone in hand, watching the light go down over a city that kept finding new ways to test whether restraint was actually a strategy or just a slower way of losing. She's considering relocating him, I said, when Elena picked up. Not confirmed. Considering. Her words, not just Vivian's. Then we need to move faster than considering, Elena said, and for once I heard something like real worry underneath the professional calm. If she files anything formal before we've secured your standing further, this could get a great deal harder for both of you before it gets easier for either of you. I sat in the garage lot after the call ended, not ready yet to go inside and explain any of it to Tessa, who would ask good questions I didn't have good answers for. The sky had gone the color of old bruises over the rooftops, and somewhere across the city, Claire was driving home to a decision she hadn't made yet, or had already made, and just hadn't found the nerve to say plainly. Either way, the clock on all of it had started running the second she said the word considering. Restraint had gotten me this far, but I understood, sitting there in the dark, that it might not be enough to keep my son in the same city much longer. Elena called at 7 in the morning, which told me before she said a single word that whatever this was, it hadn't waited for business hours to become urgent. Claire enrolled Theo at a school in Riverton yesterday, signed a 12-month lease on a rental 3 blocks from it the same afternoon. Fairmont processed a records transfer request this morning, which is how I found out, because your standing in this case flags any activity on his file automatically. I sat on the edge of my bed with the phone against my ear, feeling the floor of the last calm week I'd had drop away in real time. Riverton's 2 hours from here. That's not a fresh environment, Elena. That's a door closing. I agree, which is why I need an answer from you in the next hour, not the next day. Her voice had none of its usual, unhurried patience. I can file an emergency motion this morning for a temporary status quo order, freezing his location until the custody matter is properly resolved. If I file it, a judge could grant it by this afternoon. If I don't, they could be gone by Friday. Do it. I didn't hesitate, though some quieter part of me was already flinching at what I knew this would look like from the outside. Whatever it costs, do it. I am not losing him to 2 hours of highway, because I sat still one more time hoping everyone would eventually do the decent thing on their own. I need you to understand something before I file this, Daniel, because I won't pretend otherwise to make this easier for you. Elena paused, and I could hear her weighing exactly how much truth to hand a man about to make an irreversible choice. An emergency motion like this typically triggers a mandatory welfare interview. Someone from the court will need to speak with Theo directly, probably within days, about his home situation and his own wishes. Interview him how? I needed the specifics, needed something concrete to brace against, instead of just the vague shape of dread. Gently, by a trained evaluator, in an age-appropriate way. But he's 6, Daniel. He won't experience gentle the way we mean it. He'll experience strange adults suddenly asking him serious questions about his family, out of nowhere, with no context he can make sense of. Her voice softened, just slightly. I need you to go in with your eyes open. This will very likely frighten him before it protects him. I thought about the birdhouse, the missing wheel, the small bag of nails he'd handed me without being asked. Every fragile inch of trust I'd built one boring, patient decision at a time over the last 2 months. Is there another way? Anything that doesn't run through him. Not fast enough to matter. Not before Friday. Elena let that sit a moment. I can't make this choice for you. I can only tell you the honest cost of each direction. Losing him to another city is not a hypothetical loss you can undo later. This is. I looked out my window at the gray Belhaven morning, at a city that had never once made anything easy for me since I'd come home to it, and made the only choice that let me live with myself afterward. File it. I'll take the cost. I'd rather he be scared and closed than comfortable, and 2 hours away where I can't even be the one to explain any of it to him. I said it and meant it, and still felt the wrongness of it settle in. The arithmetic of a man choosing which kind of harm he could live with having caused. None of the options clean, and every one of them mine to carry afterward. The court granted the emergency order by 3 that afternoon, faster than either of us expected. A single page of legal language that froze Theo's residence and school enrollment in Belhaven, pending full review. It felt, for about 40 minutes, like the cleanest win I'd had since the playground, the first time this whole fight had produced something I could hold in my hand without an asterisk attached to it. Then my phone rang again, Claire's name on the screen, and I understood before I even answered that the 40 minutes were over. "You had him pulled out of class today." Her voice was shaking, not with sadness this time, but with something harder, colder, closer to fury than I'd ever heard from her. A woman he'd never met sat him down in the counselor's office and asked him if he felt safe at home, if any adult had ever hurt him, if he understood why his parents disagreed about where he should live. "Claire, I didn't choose that process. I chose to stop a move that would have put 2 hours between me and my son with 12 hours notice. He came home and asked me if I was in trouble. He asked me if he'd done something wrong by telling the woman he liked his room at Riverton's rental because it had a window seat." Her voice cracked, raw, in a way that cut through every rehearsed sentence she'd used against me for weeks. "He's 6, Daniel. He doesn't understand emergency motions and status quo orders. He understands that everything felt normal yesterday, and today strangers are asking if he's safe in his own house. And no 6-year-old walks away from that unchanged, whatever the legal paperwork says about who was right." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of exactly what Elena had warned me about land squarely on my chest, no less true for having been fully expected. "I'm sorry he was frightened. I am not sorry I stopped that move, and I need you to hear both of those things as true at the same time. I can't separate them the way you can. Not right now. Maybe not for a long time." Claire's breath came ragged on the line. "You wanted proof you were a father worth trusting. Congratulations. You're now the reason his whole world got interrupted by strangers asking if he's safe in the house he's slept in his entire life." She hung up before I could answer. I sat there with a dead phone against my ear and did the math one more time. I had won exactly the outcome I needed, and I had lost, in the same afternoon, something no timeline I controlled was ever going to hand back to me. Vivian moved within the week, efficient as always, filing her own emergency petition, citing Theo's documented distress and the evaluator's preliminary notes about a household in sudden upheaval. The petition included a summary of my military service that made 4 years of vehicle recovery sound, in her lawyer's careful language, like evidence of a man trained for aggressive, unpredictable action under pressure. It was the exact story Vivian had been building toward since that first envelope on the workbench. Patient, methodical, waiting for me to hand her one real, provable act she could point to instead of a rumor. The hearing happened in an actual courtroom this time, smaller and colder than any conference room. A judge with tired eyes who'd clearly heard 100 versions of exactly this fight and had stopped expecting any of them to end cleanly. Mr. Mercer's intervention, whatever its legal merits, produced a documented, immediate negative impact on the minor's emotional state, Vivian's attorney said, reading from notes with the practiced calm of a man who did this professionally and felt nothing personal in it at all. "We're asking the court for a 30-day pause on unsupervised or supervised contact, pending a full stability assessment. Your Honor, my client stopped an unauthorized relocation that would have severed a newly established parent-child relationship with 2 hours' notice." Elena's voice stayed level, controlled, though I could hear the strain underneath it by now. The sound of a woman fighting harder than she was letting the room see her fight. The distress cited resulted from the evaluation process itself, a process triggered by the opposing party's own conduct, not by anything Mr. Mercer did in front of the child. The judge asked if I wanted to speak, and I stood, throat tight, aware of every eye in the room, weighing whether I'd confirm exactly the picture Vivian's attorney had just painted of me. "I didn't file that motion to punish anyone, Your Honor. I filed it because I'd already lost 6 years to one piece of paper I never got to question, and I wasn't going to lose the next 6 to a lease I found out about after it was already signed." I kept my hands still at my sides, my voice level, the hardest discipline I'd practiced all week. "I regret that it frightened him. I don't regret that he's still here, 2 miles from me instead of 2 hours. That may well be true, counselor, and I'm inclined to believe both of you. for what little that's worth in a room like this one. The judge looked at me directly for the first time. Not unkind, just weary in the specific way of someone who'd learned that being right and being helpful weren't always the same thing in a room like this. But my obligation right now is to the child's immediate stability, not to assigning blame for how we got here. I'm granting a 30-day contact pause, reviewable, while the underlying custody matter proceeds. I didn't argue. There wasn't a version of arguing that would have made me look like anything other than exactly what Vivian's attorney had just described. A man pushing harder in a room built to punish pushing. Elena's hand found my forearm under the table, brief, steadying, the only comfort either of us could afford to show in front of a judge still weighing whether I was dangerous or simply exhausted. I sat there and absorbed it, the same way I'd absorbed every other cost this fight had asked of me, and told myself it was temporary, 30 days, a number I could survive if I had to. Tessa was waiting at the garage when I got back, and one look at my face told her everything the drive over hadn't already telegraphed. That bad. 30 days. No contact, supervised or otherwise. While they run a stability assessment, I never got a say in requesting. I sat down hard on the same customer's sedan hood we'd used for cold coffee weeks earlier, feeling every one of those weeks collapse into a single number. I stopped the move. Theo's still in Bellhaven, and I still lost him for a month doing it. Daniel. Tessa's voice had a careful weight to it that made me look up. Bill Hargrove's office called this morning too, before any of this. I was going to tell you tonight, gently, but I don't think there's a gentle version left in me today. Tell me. I've had enough surprises this week to last me a decade, Tessa, so just say it plain and let's get it over with. The board voted. They're terminating the contract, effective end of month. Not because of the transmission report, which by the way was genuinely excellent work. Because a county emergency custody hearing involving a business owner made the local court calendar. And calendars get read by people looking for exactly that kind of reason. Her jaw was tight, controlled. The same controlled fury she'd shown Vivian in this same lot months ago. It's gone, Daniel. The whole account. I'm sorry. I sat with that a long moment. The garage suddenly feeling smaller than it had that morning. Every cost of the last week stacking up into a single undeniable total. A son I couldn't see for 30 days. A third of our monthly income, gone for good this time, not paused. A boy somewhere across town who now associated my name with strangers, asking if he felt safe in his own house. I did the right thing. I said it out loud, mostly to hear whether it still sounded true once it left my mouth into open air. I know I did the right thing. Why does the right thing feel exactly like losing? Because sometimes it is losing, for a while. Tessa sat down next to me, no easy comfort in her voice, just the plain, hard-won honesty I'd come to rely on, more than I usually let myself admit. You didn't fail him, Daniel. You kept him in the same city he's always known. That's not nothing, even if it doesn't feel like anything close to enough tonight. It doesn't. I looked out at the lot, at the fading light, at a life that had cost me considerably more than I'd budgeted for when I decided months ago that I was going to find out the truth, no matter what it took. 30 days. I have to figure out how to be his father from 30 days away, without a single phone call, without a single chance to explain any of this to a 6-year-old who thinks I broke his whole world on purpose. Then, that's the next thing you build. Tessa's voice was quiet, steady, the same voice she used on a stubborn engine that hadn't turned over in a week. One kept promise at a time, from as far away as they're making you stand. You've done harder things than patience, Daniel. You just haven't had to do it with nothing in your hands yet. I sat in that lot until the streetlights came on, running the numbers the way I always did when the rest of me had nothing left to offer. I understood, with a clarity that felt like cold water, that I had just paid the highest price this whole fight had asked of me for a victory that didn't feel like one yet, and might not feel like one for a very long time to come. Tessa handed me a work order for a brake job on a minivan the color of old mustard, which was, she informed me, exactly the kind of unglamorous paying customer we were going to survive on, now that Hargrove's name no longer appeared anywhere on our books. I don't want your noble suffering face on my customers, Daniel. She said it without looking up from her own clipboard, already 3 cars deep into a morning that had started before either of us had properly woken up. You've got a face you make when you're punishing yourself. Leave it in the office. I don't have a face. You have several faces, and I've cataloged all of them by now. She flicked a rag at my shoulder on her way past, already reaching for the next work order before I could argue the point further. This one says you think doing excellent brake work on a minivan is somehow beneath the father you're trying to be. It isn't. Fix the brakes. Fix them well. That's the whole job today. She wasn't wrong, which was the annoying thing about Tessa most days. A talent for being right that had only sharpened since we'd started running this place together. I'd caught myself twice that week over-explaining simple repairs to ordinary customers, like competence alone might somehow reach across town and prove something to a judge, a mother, a 6-year-old who currently had no legal way to hear from me at all. The 30 days sat over the garage like weather, a pressure system nobody could see, but everyone adjusted around anyway. I didn't drive near Fairmont Elementary, not once, not even the long way around to a parts supplier that would have taken me within 4 blocks of it. I didn't call Claire. I didn't ask Elena to bend a single rule on my behalf, no matter how badly some old stubborn part of me wanted her to. Maisie showed up most afternoons after school now, dropped by a rotating cast of other parents, since Tessa's schedule had gotten tighter without Hargrove's steady income. She'd taken to sitting on the same customer's sedan hood Tessa and I had colonized months earlier, watching me work with the flat judgmental patience of a 7-year-old who considered herself an expert in adult failures. Are you sad because you can't see, Theo? Or sad because you're bad at being sad quietly? She asked it around a mouthful of the granola bar Tessa kept stocked for exactly this purpose. Not unkindly, just with the total lack of tact only children and very old men ever seem to manage without apology. Bit of both, probably. I didn't see much point lying to her. She'd catch it anyway. Mostly the first one. I'm working on the second one. Theo's my friend too, you know, even before you were his dad. She said it like a credential, which in a way it was. He asked me at school if you were mad at him. I told him that was a stupid question because you're clearly not the one who's mad, you're the one everyone else is mad at. Something tightened somewhere under my ribs at that, quick and painful. He said that he thought I was mad at him. Why would he even think that? He's 6. 6-year-olds think everything's about them, good or bad. My mom says that's developmentally normal, whatever that means. Maisie shrugged, entirely unbothered by information that had just rearranged my whole afternoon. I told him you were probably just following a rule, because you're big on rules. He seemed to like that answer better. I filed that away carefully. A small, unearned gift delivered by a 7-year-old who had no idea how much weight her casual translation carried for the man on the receiving end of it. You're welcome, by the way, Maisie added, already back to her granola bar, entirely unbothered by having just handed a grown man the best afternoon he'd had in 2 whole weeks of waiting. Elena called 2 days later with the one lawful thread I'd been waiting on, the single approved channel the court order technically permitted. A written note, submitted through counsel, reviewed, then held for delivery at Claire's discretion once the restriction lifted. Or sooner, if she chose to hand it over early. 1 page, Daniel. No pressure in it, no request for forgiveness, nothing that could read as an attempt to work around the actual restriction. Elena's voice carried its usual careful precision. Write it like you're not trying to win anything, because legally, and honestly, you aren't. I sat at the garage's cluttered desk that night longer than the page probably deserved, crossing out 4 different versions that all sounded like exactly what Elena had warned me against. A man performing patience instead of actually holding it. The version I finally sent was short. I fixed the birdhouse roof myself, the crooked way you built it, so it'll hold up better through the winter without changing how it looks. I'm not going anywhere. Whenever you're ready, so am I. No signature flourish, no plea, just a fact and a promise small enough to actually keep. Vivian, according to Elena, had someone checking with Fairmont's front office twice that week, confirming I hadn't so much as idled near the pickup loop, which told me she was still waiting for the crack she'd been counting on since the day she first walked into the garage. I didn't give her one. There was a strange, cold satisfaction in disappointing someone that thoroughly by simply doing nothing at all day after day, until the nothing itself became its own kind of proof. Graham called once, unexpectedly, the second week of the restriction, just to say Theo was eating fine and sleeping fine, and hadn't stopped talking about birdhouses to anyone who'd listen. He didn't have to make that call. I told him so, and he said he knew. And that was the whole conversation. 5 sentences that cost him nothing and meant more to me than he probably understood. The garage found its new rhythm slowly, unglamorously, exactly the way Tessa had promised it would. 1 small account at a time instead of 1 dramatic rescue. We picked up 2 small commercial accounts, a bakery's delivery van, and a landscaping outfit with 4 trucks that needed more attention than they'd been getting. Neither came remotely close to what Hargrove's contract had been worth, but both paid on time and treated us like people instead of a liability somebody upstairs needed to manage. The landscaping crew belonged to a woman named Deb, quoted a whole new transmission by 2 other shops. It wasn't the transmission, it was a sheared mount letting the assembly rock every time they loaded mulch, and I showed her the cracked metal instead of telling her about it. She sent me 2 more small fleet outfits inside a month. The way real trust travels, one careful referral at a time instead of a headline. None of it replaced Hargrove. All of it paid, and none of it came with a lecture about my community reputation. See, Tessa said, wiping down the bakery van's engine bay with real satisfaction. This is how you actually rebuild something, not waiting nobly for the big client to come crawling back with an apology bouquet. Small, steady, boring work, done right, every single day. You're annoyingly correct about most things. I know. It's a burden I carry with grace, and occasionally a wrench thrown at your head. She grinned, the first real grin I'd seen out of her in a week, and for a moment the garage felt almost like it had before any of this started, before a playground and an envelope and a folder full of somebody else's lies had rearranged the whole shape of my life. The 26th day, Claire called. Not Elena relaying a message, not a lawyer's office. Claire herself, and I nearly dropped the phone answering it. Some old instinct flaring that this could only mean something had gone catastrophically wrong. He asked about the birdhouse, she said. No preamble, her voice careful but not cold. Something new sitting underneath it I hadn't heard directed at me in longer than I wanted to count. I gave him your note last night. He read it himself, twice, and then he asked if the roof was actually fixed, or if you were just saying that. It's actually fixed. I can show him the difference if he wants. Side by side, the old nails against the new ones. He wants to see it. A pause. Longer than the sentence needed, like she was deciding how much more to give me before she'd used up whatever courage had gotten her to dial the number in the first place. He asked, Daniel, I didn't suggest it. I want you to know that part specifically because I know how much it's going to matter to you. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling something loosen in my chest that had been clenched tight since the moment that Judge's gavel had ended contact 30 days ago. Thank you for telling me that part specifically. There's a family center downtown. Supervised, structured, the kind of space Elena's probably already mentioned to you. I can set something up for after the restriction lifts, 4 days from now. Claire's voice steadied, businesslike now. The careful administrator reasserting herself over whatever rawer thing had made the call happen at all. I'm not promising anything beyond that first visit. I need you to hear that too. I hear it. 4 days, a fixed birdhouse, and whatever he decides to do with either of those things once he's standing in front of them. I closed my eyes, let myself feel the relief for exactly 1 full breath before setting it carefully back down where it couldn't get ahead of itself. That's more than I had yesterday, Claire. I know how to be patient with more than I had yesterday. She hung up without either of us saying anything else, and I sat in the garage office a long while, turning the whole conversation over, the way I turned over every hard-won thing lately. Looking for the catch, the cost, the fine print that always seemed to travel with any good news this fight had ever been willing to hand me so far. I didn't find one this time. Just a boy who'd read a short note twice and decided, entirely on his own, that a fixed roof was worth seeing for himself, in person, on his own timeline. The family center's kitchen room smelled like dish soap and old crayons, a small counter and a table built low enough for kids. A facilitator named Rosa parked quietly in the corner with a clipboard she mostly used as a prop. Theo was already there when I walked in, standing on a step stool at the counter, and he turned to look at me with the flat, appraising expression of a foreman inspecting a new hire. You're on sandwiches, Graham's on the fruit, I'm in charge of the whole thing. Understood. I hung my jacket on the hook by the door, resisting the urge to ask whether this was actually the day's approved activity or something Theo had unilaterally declared the moment he walked in. What kind of sandwiches am I making, boss? Peanut butter, honey, and pickle. I read about it in a book, and everyone said it sounds disgusting, so we're proving them wrong today. He said it with total conviction, the specific certainty of a 6-year-old who has never once let popular opinion slow him down. There was a whole philosophy buried in that, if you looked for it, a kid who had decided the world's opinion was a thing to argue with, rather than a verdict to accept. And I recognized the stance immediately, because it was mine, just worn a size too big for him yet. Graham, already sorting grapes into a bowl at the far counter, caught my eye briefly, something wry passing between us that hadn't been there a month ago. For what it's worth, I already told him this combination sounds like a war crime. He didn't care. He usually doesn't. I found the peanut butter jar and got to work, because arguing with the chef felt like a losing strategy on day 1 back in the room. Pickle goes where, exactly? Inside. Or is this a side dish situation? Inside. Obviously, inside. What's the point of a sandwich if the pickle's just sitting there, being sad on the plate? Theo delivered this like established culinary law, watching my knife work with the same suspicious scrutiny he'd given the birdhouse's axle pin. I built the sandwich exactly to his specification, pickle and all, layered with the kind of careful precision I usually reserve for torque settings, and set it on the plate for his inspection. He picked it up, turned it over twice, like he was checking for structural flaws, and took a bite with the solemnity of a judge at a very serious competition. "It's actually not bad." He said it almost accusingly, like the sandwich had personally inconvenienced him by working. Graham said it would be gross. It's not gross. It's weird, but it's not gross. Different things. Weird and gross. I took a bite of my own for demonstration purposes, mostly to prove I wasn't going to make him eat something I wouldn't touch myself. It was, in fact, weird. It was not, strictly speaking, gross. Graham brought the fruit bowl over, grapes cut carefully in half the way you're supposed to for a kid Theo's age, and set it down without comment on the sandwich verdict, though I caught the faint twitch of his mouth that meant he was filing the loss away privately. "You cut the grapes in half," Theo observed, inspecting the bowl. "You always cut the grapes in half." "I'm 6, not 2, Graham. I know how to not choke on a grape now. Old habit. I'll work on it." Graham said it lightly, but something behind his eyes flickered, and I recognized the sting of a man realizing a small, careful ritual he'd built out of love had quietly become unnecessary without him noticing the exact day it happened. "It's not bad that you did it. It's just not needed anymore." Theo said it with surprising gentleness for someone who'd just delivered a fairly direct correction, and Graham's shoulders eased slightly, grateful for the softer landing. I watched the two of them navigate that small moment and felt something settle low and warm in me that had nothing to do with sandwiches. This was what I told Elena I wanted, months ago, in her office above the dry cleaner. Not ownership, a foothold, a seat at a table where Graham's history with this kid didn't have to be erased for mine to exist alongside it. Claire watched from a chair near the door, close enough to intervene, far enough to let the room actually belong to the three of us and Rosa's mostly decorative clipboard. She hadn't said much since we'd arrived, and I recognized the exact quality of her silence. The same watchful stillness from the birdhouse session. A woman doing careful math on an equation that kept refusing to balance the way she wanted it to. Theo finished arranging the plates with the focus of a man setting a formal table, then straightened up, wiped his hands on his jeans, and looked at his mother with an expression that had nothing playful left in it at all. He set down the last plate very carefully, like he needed both hands free and steady for whatever was coming next in this small, crowded kitchen. "Mom, did you tell Daniel I died?" His voice stayed flat, matter of fact. A question asked the same way he'd have asked about the weather. The question landed in the room like a dropped plate, sudden and total, and I watched every adult present freeze in a slightly different way. Rosa's pen stopped moving. Graham's hand went still over the grape bowl. Claire's face drained of color so fast I thought, for one terrible second, she might actually faint in the chair. "Theo, where did you hear something like that?" Claire's voice came out too fast, too high. The careful administrator entirely absent now, just a frightened mother caught with nowhere left to redirect the conversation. "I didn't hear it anywhere. I just thought about it." He said it with the terrible simplicity only a child can manage. No drama in his voice, just a plain question he'd apparently been carrying around unspoken for longer than any of us had realized. Daniel looked at me like a ghost that first day at the playground. Nobody looks at a kid like that unless they thought he was dead. And somebody had to tell him that on purpose. Claire opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again, and nothing came out that resembled an actual answer to a question that deserved one. I watched her reach for the old habit, the sideways slide into logistics or reassurance or anything that wasn't the plain truth, sitting in the middle of the table between 3 sandwiches and a bowl of grapes. "Bud." I pitched it as gentle and level as I could manage, though my heart was hammering hard enough that I was fairly sure everyone in the room could hear it slamming. "That's a fair question, and it deserves a real answer, but it's your mom's answer to give, not mine. I'm not going to take that away from her by answering it for her." "Why not? You know the answer. I can tell you know it." Theo turned that same suspicious, evaluating look on me now, the one that had once been reserved for missing axle pins. "Everyone in this room knows something except me. That's not fair. It's my life." "You're right. It's not fair." I said it plainly, because lying to him about that felt worse than every other hard thing I'd had to say in this entire fight. But some truths need the right person to say them, in the right way, so they land as care instead of just a fact thrown at you sideways. I'm asking you to give your mom that chance, even though I know waiting is the worst part. Graham had gone very quiet beside the grape bowl, and when I glanced over, something had shifted behind his careful, composed face. Some private recalculation running that he clearly hadn't expected to have to run today. Claire. He said her name slow, almost cautious, like a man testing ice he wasn't sure would hold his weight. What is he talking about? Not here. Claire's voice had dropped to something raw and pleading, aimed at all three of us at once. Please. Not here. Not like this. In front of Rosa and a plate of sandwiches. I need to do this properly. I promise you I will. Just not in this exact minute. Theo studied her a long moment, 6 years old and somehow entirely capable of recognizing a stall when he heard one, then looked down at his own half-eaten sandwich like it had suddenly lost all its earlier importance. Okay, he said it quiet, defeated in a way that hurt worse than if he'd shouted. But I'm going to keep asking, every time, until somebody actually tells me instead of just looking scared about it. Rosa, professional and unobtrusive, finally spoke, gentle but clear. I think that's a good note to pause the session on today. Theo, you did wonderful work leading the kitchen. Let's give everyone a little time to think, and we'll pick this back up soon. The visit ended early, the sandwiches half finished, and Claire took Theo out first, one hand on his shoulder, neither of them looking back. Graham lingered a moment at the door, and when he finally looked at me, whatever careful neutrality he'd maintained through every prior meeting had entirely burned away. Is it true? He asked it low, urgent, none of his usual measured calm left in it at all. Whatever he's asking about. Is there something Claire never told me either? I chose my words with more care than I'd used all day, because this was Graham's history too now, whether either of us had wanted it to become that or not. I think you should ask her, Graham. Not me. But I think you already know the answer's yes, or you wouldn't be asking me instead of just walking out that door after her. He held my eyes a long moment, something breaking loose behind them that had clearly been sitting there, unexamined, for longer than today's kitchen had taken to crack it open. Then he turned and followed Claire and Theo out without another word, leaving me alone in a room that smelled like dish soap and unfinished sandwiches. Rosa gathered her clipboard, quiet and professional, pausing at the door long enough to glance back at the 3 abandoned plates, mine and Graham's untouched grapes, Theo's sandwich cooling into something nobody was going to finish eating today. That happens sometimes, she said, not unkindly, the voice of someone who'd watched 100 careful family arrangements crack open exactly like this one just had. Kids know more than we give them credit for. They just wait for the safest room to say it out loud in. Was this the safest room or the worst possible one? I asked it half to her, half to the empty kitchen itself, still hearing the flat, terrible simplicity in Theo's voice. Nobody looks at a kid like that unless they thought he was dead. Probably both, honestly. Safe enough that he trusted it. Public enough that nobody could manage him into silence about it afterward. Rosa offered a small, tired smile. I've learned not to predict which one a family needs more. I gathered my jacket and let myself out into the parking lot, the autumn air sharp after the kitchen's warm, sandwich-scented closeness, and sat in my truck a long while before I trusted my hands enough to actually drive anywhere. Whatever came next, none of us were going back to the version of events we'd all been carefully managing an hour ago. Theo had cracked it wide open himself, with 6 plain words and a sandwich he'd insisted on making entirely his own way. Graham showed up at the garage on a Tuesday evening, still in his work clothes, standing in the bay entrance like a man who'd talked himself into this 3 separate times on the drive over and was already reconsidering a 4th. Tessa clocked him before I did, glanced between us once, and found an urgent reason to reorganize the parts shelf in the back office, which was her own way of granting privacy, without ever admitting out loud that she was doing it. Got a minute, Daniel? It wasn't really a question, and I set down the wrench I'd been using on a customer's alternator and wiped my hands, giving him my full attention, because something in his voice told me this wasn't a social call. He had grease on his good shoes and had not noticed it, which told me more than his face did. Graham was a man who noticed grease. A Graham who did not was a man running on something a good deal louder than his own composure. Claire told me. 2 nights ago. He said it flat, no preamble, watching my face for a reaction I tried hard not to give him. Not everything, I don't think. Enough. The transfer, your mother-in-law's money, the note that got typed up to make it look official. Enough to understand why a 6-year-old asked that question in a kitchen. How are you doing with that? I answered him evenly, because I'd had weeks to sit with this weight, and he'd had 2 days, and that gap felt like it mattered. Badly. He almost laughed. Short and bitter, nothing warm in it at all. I've spent 4 years building a life with a woman I thought I understood completely, being a father to a boy I thought had been genuinely, tragically abandoned by his real one. Turns out I was cast in somebody else's play, and nobody thought to hand me the whole script before opening night. I'm not going to pretend that isn't a fair thing to be furious about. I leaned against the workbench, giving him room to keep going, because he clearly hadn't driven over here just to deliver one paragraph and leave. I don't think you did anything wrong here, and I want you to hear that. You built something real with him. That part was never the lie, wasn't it though? Graham's jaw worked, something raw and unguarded, showing through his usual careful composure. I told him his father chose deployments over him. I told him that, Daniel, more than once, gently, the way you're supposed to tell a kid a hard truth. Except it wasn't true. I was the one lying to him, secondhand, without even knowing I was doing it. You believed what you were told. That's different from lying. I said it plainly, because he deserved the distinction even if it didn't fully absolve the ache underneath his question. I'm not interested in making you the villain in this, Graham. I've got real villains already. You're not one of them. He studied me a long moment, some old wariness still sitting in the set of his jaw, unwilling to accept comfort this easily after everything. You could use me right now. You know that. I'm angry enough to say things in a courtroom that would make Claire's position considerably harder. Some men in your position would already be working the angle. I'm not going to ask you to turn on her for my benefit. I said it steady because I'd thought about exactly this possibility more than once since the kitchen and always landed in the same place. I don't need you as a weapon against Claire, Graham. I need you honest with Theo, whatever that ends up costing either of us. That's the whole ask. Something in his shoulders eased slightly at that, though the wariness didn't fully leave his face. That's a strange answer from a man who's spent months fighting for every inch of access he's got. Fighting Vivian, fighting Kessler, fighting a piece of paper that said I'd walked away from my own son. I shook my head, tired in a way that had nothing to do with the alternator still waiting half assembled on the lift. You've never once been the actual obstacle, Graham, whatever it looked like from where you were standing. You've just been standing closest to the thing I actually wanted. That's an uncomfortably generous way to describe 4 years of me. Quietly hoping you'd stay overseas, if I'm being honest with both of us. He said it low, almost ashamed, an admission that clearly cost him something to hand over. I didn't know the truth. I still wanted you gone. That's not nothing either, Daniel, whatever excuse I give it afterward. No, it isn't. I didn't try to soften that for him, because he clearly hadn't driven over here asking to be let off easy. But wanting the easy version of a hard situation isn't the same crime as building the hard situation in the first place. I can hold both of those as true without needing you to disappear over it. Maybe, but turning you into ammunition doesn't get me a single extra hour with my son. It just makes the whole thing uglier for a kid who's already had enough ugly handed to him this year. I picked the wrench back up, mostly for something to do with my hands while I said what came next. I watched you cut his grapes in half out of habit. I watched him gently tell you it wasn't needed anymore, and I watched you take that correction, like it actually mattered to you. That's not nothing, Graham. That's most of what actually matters. He was quiet a long moment, something working behind his face that looked like a man recalculating a rivalry he'd been bracing for since the day I first showed up at that playground fence. Can I ask you something? And I want an honest answer, not the diplomatic one. Go ahead. I set down the wrench entirely this time, giving him the full weight of my attention instead of half of it. Do you resent me for being there for the years you weren't? Forgetting the bedtime stories and the scraped knees and the first day of kindergarten while you were grieving a son they told you was already ashes, 2,000 miles away. His voice had gone careful, exposed in a way I hadn't seen from him before. I need to know if I'm standing across from a man who's just being patient until he can push me out entirely. Some days, yeah, I won't lie to you about that. I met his eyes because he'd earned the honest answer over the diplomatic one. There's a part of me that will always ache over every year you got that I didn't. That's not really about you though. That's about 6 years I can't get back from anyone, and you happen to be standing closest to the years I'm grieving. But no, I don't want you gone, Graham. Theo doesn't need one father replacing another like a part swapped out of an engine. He needs adults who can stand in the same room without either of us needing to win something. I set the wrench down again, done pretending it was actually useful to the conversation. I'm not trying to push you out. I'm trying to find out if there's room for both of us, because I think that's actually what he wants, if anyone bothers asking him. Graham exhaled slowly, his posture finally settling in a way it hadn't managed since he walked in. Vivian wants a unified family statement. For the foundation board, Ahead of some review she's suddenly very concerned about. A page confirming the family remains stable, committed, moving forward together, framing the whole mess as an unfortunate historical irregularity rather than what it actually was. And she wants your signature on it. Same as Claire's, same as anyone else standing close enough to the family to matter. She reminded me, very politely, that most of my physical therapy referrals come through foundation-affiliated pediatric offices, that my professional life would become considerably more difficult if I wasn't seen as, and I'm quoting her exactly, a team player during a sensitive family transition. His mouth twisted with something bitter. She's not subtle once the stakes get high enough. I don't think she actually knows how to be subtle when she's frightened, which is its own kind of interesting to watch. What are you going to do? I asked it carefully, aware that whatever he said next would tell me more about the man than 4 months of watching him at library tables and workshop meetings ever had. I drove here instead of signing it, which should probably tell you something before I even say the rest out loud. He pulled a folded page from his jacket pocket, held it a moment like it weighed considerably more than paper actually does, and didn't hand it over. Just let me see it existed. I'm not going to sign a document that calls what happened to you an irregularity. I lied to a 6-year-old for years without knowing it. I'm not doing it again on purpose, in writing, for a woman who thinks my mortgage is leverage. That's going to cost you. Referrals, standing, whatever protection being useful to her has bought you until now. I said it plainly, because he deserved to walk into this with his eyes as open as mine had been walking into every hard choice this fight had demanded of me. I'm not going to pretend that's a small thing to give up. No, it isn't. Graham refolded the page, careful, final. But I've spent 4 years telling that boy that honesty matters more than comfort. I'm not going to be the adult who taught him that lesson and then failed it the first time it actually cost me something real. He left without asking me for anything else. No alliance offered or requested, just a man walking back out into the evening, carrying an unsigned page that was going to make his life measurably harder, starting the moment Vivian read it. I stood in the bay a long while after his taillights disappeared, turning over the strange, hard-won shape of what had just happened. Vivian had built her whole strategy on the assumption that everyone around her had a price low enough to meet. Graham had just quietly, without any speeches, proven her wrong about at least one of them. And something told me she wasn't going to take that particular loss gracefully once she found out. Tessa emerged from the back office the moment his taillights cleared the lot, arms crossed, clearly having heard considerably more of the conversation than her parts shelf alibi suggested. Well, she said it slow, weighing it. That was not the man I expected to walk out of here still standing on your side of the room. Neither did I, honestly. I picked the wrench back up, mostly because my hands needed something ordinary to do while the rest of me caught up with what had just happened. I think Vivian just lost the one piece on the board she assumed would never move. Good. Tessa's voice carried real satisfaction, the specific kind she reserved for watching a stubborn engine finally turn over after a long, frustrating diagnosis. Every time she loses a piece she was counting on, this gets 1 inch closer to actually being over. I'll take an inch tonight, Daniel. I've learned not to ask this fight for more than that at once. I finished the alternator alone that night, long after Tessa had gone home, turning Graham's unsigned page over in my mind the way I used to turn over a stubborn bolt, looking for the exact angle that would finally let something long stuck start moving freely once again. The Whitmore Children's Foundation occupied the top 2 floors of a glass building downtown, the kind of lobby with a water feature nobody actually looked at, and the woman who met me there introduced herself as Evelyn Shaw, board treasurer, before I'd even made it past security. Thank you for coming, Mr. Mercer. I know this building probably isn't your favorite address in Bellhaven right now, given everything. She had the brisk, careful warmth of someone who managed difficult donors for a living, and had clearly decided I might be one, in whatever strange new category I now occupied. It's not, I said, because pretending otherwise felt like a worse foundation to start this conversation on. But I understand why the foundation needs to have this meeting. I'll give you what I actually know. Elena had coached me the night before, over the phone, in the same careful tone she used for every meeting that mattered. Answer only what they ask. Don't perform outrage for a room that hasn't earned it yet. Let the facts do what facts do when nobody's shouting over them. I held on to that the whole ride up in the elevator, past floors with names on the directory I didn't recognize, trying to remember that this room, unlike every courtroom and conference room before it, actually wanted to land on the right answer if I let it get there on its own. The elevator opened on the lower floor first, on a bright room behind glass, where a dozen kids sat on a rug through some kind of reading circle. Parents lined along the back wall with the tired patience of people who'd fought to be in that room at all. Family services, Evelyn said, following my look. Reunification support, mostly. Custody transitions. The part nobody prints on a gala invitation. She said it without pride and without apology, showing me the actual product before she asked me to protect its reputation. I watched a boy about Theo's age lose a fight with a juice pouch and get helped by a staffer who didn't make it a whole event, and I understood what I would not be trading upstairs for a cleaner outcome. Not Theo's history, not any of theirs, to make a glass building look kind. You walked me through here on purpose, I said. Evelyn didn't bother denying it. People tell truer things after they've seen who the reputation actually belongs to, she answered, and pressed the button for the top floor. The review room upstairs held 6 people around a long table, Foundation Council, 2 board members I didn't recognize, Evelyn at the head. Owen Kessler sat near the far end, folder already open in front of him like a man who had never once, in 30 years, walked into a room unprepared for what was coming. We're conducting an internal risk assessment, Evelyn began, once everyone had settled, regarding allegations connected to a historical incident at Whitmore Memorial and this foundation's donor relationship with that institution. We'd like your account, Mr. Mercer, and we'd like to understand exactly what you're seeking from this committee specifically. Accountability, safeguards, not a spectacle, and definitely not a headline anywhere. I kept my hands flat on the table, steady, because I'd rehearsed this part on the drive over more than once. I'm not here to give you a redemption story you can put in a donor newsletter. I have a 6-year-old son who's already had strangers ask him if he feels safe in his own house. I'm not handing you his private history to make your institution look compassionate. One of the board members, a younger man in an expensive suit, leaned forward with the open eagerness of someone who'd already drafted the press release in his head. Mr. Mercer, I understand the instinct toward privacy, but a story like yours, framed carefully, could actually demonstrate the Foundation's commitment to exactly the kind of family it exists to protect. There's real value in— No, I said it flat, cutting him off before the sentence could finish becoming the thing I could already feel it turning into. My son is not a marketing opportunity for an institution that funded the concealment of his own birth. I'll give you facts. I will not give you his story to package. Evelyn's expression shifted, something recalibrating behind her careful composure, and she held up a hand toward the younger board member before he could argue the point further. Noted and respected. Let's proceed with facts then. Mr. Mercer, what specifically are you asking this foundation to examine? Whether Vivian Whitmore used foundation funds and influence to arrange a concealed transfer 6 years ago, whether Owen Kessler, acting under her direction or his own initiative, falsified a hospital record to support that concealment. Whether either of those facts should affect this foundation's pending partnership with the hospital network he currently represents. I laid it out plain, no embellishment, because the facts didn't need decoration to land with their full weight. Kessler didn't flinch, didn't even look up from his folder right away. The same practiced stillness I'd watched him deploy in every room he'd ever sat across from me in. I'd like to address the credibility of the source behind these allegations, if the committee will permit it. Go ahead, Evelyn said, though her tone suggested she was already less patient with him than she'd been in prior meetings I hadn't attended. Helen Cho is a retired nurse with, by her own admission, incomplete and fragmentary recollection of events from 6 years ago. She's expressed guilt about that period repeatedly, which raises reasonable questions about whether her memory has been shaped by that guilt rather than by what actually occurred. Kessler's voice stayed smooth, bloodless, exactly the register I'd learned to recognize as his most dangerous one, the one he reached for whenever the ground underneath him had started to shift. I don't say this to discredit her as a person. I say it because uncorroborated memory from a guilt-stricken witness is a thin foundation for the kind of institutional action being proposed here. She's not the only source. Everything in me wanted to raise my voice. I didn't. There's a transfer record, a missing civil death registration, my own military travel record, which already disproved one of your prior claims in a formal review. This isn't one frightened woman's memory standing alone, Mr. Kessler, and you know that. I know that a pattern of documents can be assembled to suggest many things, Mr. Mercer, without any single one of them proving the coordinated concealment you're describing. Kessler folded his hands. I'd also note, respectfully, that if any falsification occurred, it likely originated with information provided by the mother at the time, information I had no independent way to verify against her account. I felt that land the way I'd felt it land in that first conference room. Cold and precise. Claire's name offered up again as convenient cover the moment the ground shifted under him. Evelyn's pen had stopped moving entirely. You're doing it again. I said it quiet, almost tired, watching him with something closer to pity than anger now. Every single time the story stops protecting you, you find a way to make it protect you by making it Claire's fault instead. I think everyone at this table has noticed the pattern by now. I'm simply being precise about the limits of my own knowledge. Kessler's composure didn't crack, though something behind his eyes had gone very still. A man watching the room's temperature change and recalculating his position in real time. Evelyn set down her own pen, deliberate, and looked around the table at her fellow board members before speaking again, her voice carrying a new weight that hadn't been there at the meeting's start. I want to be direct with everyone here. This foundation exists to protect children, not to protect the reputations of donors or partner institutions when those reputations come into conflict with that mission. Mrs. Whitmore has been a defining presence on this board for over a decade. I understand the discomfort in what I'm about to propose. She looked directly at the younger board member who'd suggested the redemption narrative earlier, and the weight of her gaze alone made him sit back slightly. But I'm recommending we suspend the pending Bellhaven Pediatric Network partnership pending independent review, and that Mrs. Whitmore be recused from any further involvement in that review effective today. One of the other board members, an older woman who'd said nothing the entire meeting, finally spoke. Her voice quiet but carrying real authority. I've sat on this board 12 years, Evelyn. I've never once heard you recommend suspending a partnership of this size. I take that seriously, and I suspect everyone else at this table should too. I take it seriously too, which is exactly why I'm recommending it. Evelyn didn't look away from Kessler while she answered. We built this foundation's entire reputation on the promise that we protect children first. I'm not going to be the treasurer who let that promise become optional the one time it actually cost us something real. The room went quiet, the way it does when a decision that had seemed impossible an hour earlier suddenly becomes the only reasonable option left on the table. Kessler's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The first crack I'd seen in him since he'd first opened that folder weeks ago. That's a significant institutional decision based on allegations that remain, as I've said, uncorroborated. His voice had lost some of its earlier smoothness, something harder and more urgent showing through. It's a significant institutional decision based on a pattern this committee has now personally watched you construct, twice, in the span of one meeting. Evelyn's voice stayed level, but there was no more warmth in it for him at all. We'll be requesting your full cooperation with the independent review, Mr. Kessler. I'd encourage you to consider how that cooperation looks going forward compared to how the last 20 minutes have looked. I sat there feeling something loosen that had nothing to do with vindication, though I'd half expected vindication to be exactly what this moment felt like when I finally got it. It didn't feel like winning. It felt like watching people finally do the plain, obvious right thing. Months too late for it to feel like anything but overdue. The younger board member who'd been so eager to package my story for a donor newsletter wouldn't meet my eyes now, studying the grain of the table like it might rewrite the last 20 minutes into something more comfortable for him. Evelyn walked me out afterward, past the water feature nobody looked at, and paused at the elevator with something almost apologetic in her expression. I'm sorry it took this long, Mr. Mercer. And I'm sorry the easiest path here would have been to let you become the story instead of the man asking for accountability. I appreciate you not taking the easy path. I meant it, though exhaustion had mostly replaced whatever triumph I might have felt an hour ago walking in. I could have given that boardroom a much better show today. Angrier, more satisfying to watch. I didn't come here for a show though, and I never really wanted one. No, I noticed. Evelyn studied me a moment, something like genuine respect settling slowly into her expression as she said it. Mrs. Whitmore built her whole position on the assumption that grief eventually makes people careless, sloppy, easy to catch out in public. You've been remarkably careful for a man who has every reason not to be. Careful's the only thing that's actually worked in the end. I stepped into the elevator, watching the doors start to close on a building I sincerely hoped never to need to enter again. Everything else just gave her something new to use against me. The elevator doors closed on that thought, and I rode down alone, already turning toward the next fight waiting for me outside. The one Kessler's cornered blame shifting had just guaranteed would land, sooner rather than later, squarely on Claire. I thought about calling her before I'd even reached my truck, then didn't, because whatever warning I wanted to give her needed to come from someone she trusted more than she currently trusted me. I called Elena instead, and told her Kessler was about to hand Claire a defense with her name written all through it, whether Claire had done anything to earn that or not. Claire called 2 days after the foundation review, her voice steadier than I'd heard it in months, and asked if I had a few hours free that weekend. I want to show you where it actually happened. Not tell you, show you. I think I owe you that instead of another conversation across a desk. She drove us there herself, a modest brick building on the quiet edge of downtown with a discreet sign reading Whitmore Family Recovery Residence, the kind of place built to look like a boutique hotel while actually functioning as exactly what its name suggested. This is where they kept me. Not kept, that's not fair. I checked myself in, technically. Claire parked across the street and sat with her hands on the wheel a long moment before continuing. I stayed here for the 4 days you were in transit. My mother said it would let me rest properly, away from the noise of the main hospital, close enough that I could be reached the moment there was news. You couldn't see him, or you chose not to. I asked it gently, but I needed the distinction, same as I'd needed it from her before. I could have. I chose not to, most of those days. I told myself I couldn't survive walking into a room where he might not survive the visit. Her voice stayed level, though I could see her knuckles whitening slightly against the wheel. I understand now that keeping me here, comfortable, separated, gave her 4 uninterrupted days to arrange everything without me watching closely enough to ask real questions. A woman came out the front door in scrubs, glanced at us idling across the street, then went back inside without any particular curiosity. Just another car, another visitor, deciding whether to come in. Claire watched her go, with an expression I couldn't quite read. I used to sit in that exact window seat, right there, second floor. I told myself I was resting. I think, if I'm honest, some part of me already understood that resting meant not asking the questions that would have ruined my mother's plan before it finished forming. We sat there a while, looking at a building that had swallowed 4 of the worst days of both our lives from 2 completely different angles, and I found I didn't have anything cutting to say to her about it. The anger was still there. It had just stopped being the only thing in the room, crowded now by something quieter that felt almost like grief for the version of this year neither of us had gotten to have. "There's somewhere else," she said finally, pulling back into traffic. "About 40 minutes out. I haven't been back since we moved away, but I think you need to see it too." The second place was a low, comfortable guest house at the edge of a family property outside Bellhaven, surrounded by the kind of manicured privacy that money buys without ever having to ask permission from anyone. Claire parked at the gate rather than driving in, like even now she didn't feel entitled to just walk back onto it. He came here straight from the receiving hospital, once he was stable enough to leave. Not to our house, here. My mother said it needed to stay quiet a while longer, that the story needed time to settle before anyone got close enough to question it. Claire's voice thinned as she looked at the house through the gate's iron bars. I nursed him here for the first 2 months of his life, in a house that wasn't mine, under a name that wasn't his, while you grieved a death that was never actually real. A gardener moved along the far hedge line, trimming something with slow, unhurried care, entirely unaware he was working within sight of the exact spot where 6 years of my life had quietly been decided without me. Claire watched him too, her eyes distant. "There's a window on the second floor, the one with the yellow curtain still up. That was his room, back when he was small enough to fit in one arm. I used to stand at that gate some mornings, right where we're standing now, and think about driving straight to the base to find you myself. I never did. I told myself the timing was never right, and some part of me knew that was a lie even then." She reached into her bag and pulled out a thin folder, offering it to me with a hand that wasn't quite steady. Texts, some emails. I kept copies I probably shouldn't have kept, out of some instinct I didn't understand until recently. My mother telling me what to say if anyone asked, instructions about which name to use, which forms to sign, who not to call. I opened it right there at the gate, unable to wait, and found exactly what she'd promised. A message from Vivian dated the week of the birth. "Tell no one the transfer name. I've handled the coordinator." Another, 3 weeks later. "The story is settled now. Stay settled with it." A third, months after that, colder and more procedural. "If you waver now, you lose everything I've built for both of you. Think about what that actually means before you speak to anyone. I read each one twice, feeling the shape of 6 years rearrange itself around 3 short, ordinary-looking sentences, the kind you could mistake for concern if you didn't already know exactly what they'd cost. I took the folder carefully, aware of exactly how much it must have cost her to hand it over, evidence that would damage her own position as thoroughly as it would damage Vivian's. Why give me this now, Claire? You could have kept sitting on it. Because Graham stopped trusting the story before I told him the truth. Because Owen Kessler tried to sell me out to a room full of strangers without blinking. And somewhere in the middle of watching both of those things happen, I understood I was the last person still protecting a version of events that never actually protected me either, no matter how carefully I'd managed it. She looked at me directly, something raw and finally honest in her face. I've spent 6 years thinking silence was safety. It was just a slower kind of losing. I didn't have an answer ready that wouldn't land as either absolution or a verdict, so I held the folder a little tighter and let the silence tell her I'd heard every word, which was the most honest thing I had to give. Her phone rang before I could answer, Vivian's name lighting up the screen, and Claire's whole body went tense, braced for a blow she already knew the shape of. She answered it on speaker, without asking me, like she wanted a witness this time instead of a private room to be managed in. Claire, I need you to tell me you haven't done anything foolish with that man today. Vivian's voice carried none of its usual polish, thin and urgent in a way I'd never heard from her. I showed him the recovery residence, and the guest house, and I gave him copies of your texts, Mother. Claire's voice didn't waver, though I watched her free hand grip the folder tighter against her chest. I'm done being the last piece keeping your story standing up. Do you understand what you're doing to yourself? Your position at the foundation, already under review because of him. Your housing, still technically under family trust. Your standing as his mother. If this becomes the kind of story a court reads as instability rather than growth. Vivian's threats came fast now, stacked one on top of another, the practiced cadence of a woman used to winning through sheer accumulated weight. I can still protect you from all of that, Claire, if you simply deny the worst of it and let me handle the rest, the way I always have. I don't want you handling anything else for me. Claire's voice cracked, but she didn't stop, didn't reach for the phone to end the call the way I half expected her to. I want to tell my son the truth and let the consequences be mine to actually carry, instead of yours to manage from a safe distance while I do the actual living with what we did to him. The silence on the line stretched long enough that I thought Vivian might have hung up already, defeated by a daughter who'd finally stopped being manageable. You'll regret this, she said instead, quiet now, almost sad in a way that sounded more calculating than genuine, when it's too late to take back. Maybe, but it'll be my regret, Mother, earned honestly, instead of another 6 years of yours borrowed against my life. Claire ended the call herself this time, hands shaking now that the performance of steadiness no longer had an audience worth maintaining it for. I sat with her a long moment in the truck, the guest house sitting quiet and expensive behind its iron gate, and felt the full weight of a decision I'd been circling since that conference room weeks ago finally settle into something I could actually act on. I could ask for everything right now, Claire. Full custody, supervised visitation only, permanently, on my terms. I've got the Foundation's own findings behind me. Graham's statement, your own admission on a recorded line just now. I said it plainly, watching her brace for exactly that outcome. I'm not going to ask for any of it. She looked at me, wary, uncertain whether this was mercy or a setup for something worse. Why not? You'd win. Everyone would understand if you did. Because Theo doesn't need a father who punishes his mother into disappearing. He needs both of us, honest and imperfect, sharing the actual work of raising him instead of one of us controlling the whole story alone. I held her eyes, making sure she understood I meant it completely. I want shared decisions, real transparency, no more managing what he's told and when. You keep being his mother, Claire. You just don't get to be the only author of his life anymore. Claire's composure finally broke. Quiet tears, rather than the dramatic kind, and she nodded slowly, like accepting an offer she hadn't believed would actually be extended to her. That's more generous than I've earned. Probably. I allowed myself a small, tired smile. I didn't say it was about what you'd earned. I said it was about what he actually needs, and it turns out that's not the same calculation at all. We drove back to Belhaven mostly in silence, the folder of Vivian's text sitting between us on the seat like a small heavy fact neither of us needed to discuss further. And somewhere past the city limits, Claire spoke again, quieter this time. There's one more thing you should probably know before Kessler finds out I've turned. He's been drafting something. A formal defense for the network's governance board, ahead of the partnership decision. I don't know everything in it, but I know my name is in it, and I don't think he wrote it to protect me. I thought about the pattern I'd watched him run twice now, denial giving way to blame the moment the ground shifted beneath him. I understood exactly what kind of document was probably already sitting in a folder on his desk, polished and bloodless, waiting for the moment it would do him the most good and everyone else the most damage. "Thank you for telling me before he uses it," I said, and Claire nodded once, worn down like someone who'd spent the whole day handing over pieces of herself and had nothing left to spare for a longer answer. I dropped her at her car outside the garage that evening, folder still in my hands, and sat alone afterward, turning Vivian's 3 messages over in my mind. I was certain of one thing above everything else the day had cost either of us. Kessler was about to make the same mistake with Claire that he'd already made twice with me, and this time I intended to be ready for it before he'd even finished writing the first draft. Theo had questions about hinges. He'd taken a cabinet door apart at Claire's over the weekend, and by our supervised hour, 3 loose screws were lined up on the garage counter, while he interrogated me about which one went where. The hour had migrated to the shop by then, Claire reading in the office with the door propped open, close enough to hear and far enough to let it be ours. "This one's stripped," he said, holding it up. "You can't fix a stripped screw. You admit it's dead and get a new one. That's most of the job, honestly, knowing which parts are actually dead." I dug a replacement out of the coffee can I kept for exactly this, and he tested it against the light, suspicious, before nodding once. Then, without looking up from the screws, he asked the thing he'd clearly been carrying all afternoon. "Did you know about me? Before? When I was a baby?" I set the screwdriver down. In the office, Claire's page stopped turning. "No, I didn't know. The day I found out you were here, I came, and I haven't gone anywhere since. That part I can promise you, whatever anybody's paperwork says." "Okay," he said it flat, filing the answer with the screws, and I understood not to make it any bigger than the single word he'd handed me. Then, because he was 6 and done with the heavy part, "You still owe me a hinge that doesn't squeak." I told him I was good for it. He went back to sorting screws like the matter was tabled rather than closed, and I stood there, wanting, more than I wanted the meeting across town, to be a man whose record matched the promise I'd just made my son. Elena arranged the meeting 2 days before the network's partnership response deadline, a narrow window Kessler's own institution had set for itself, and I walked into her office above the dry cleaner one more time, knowing exactly how small an offer I intended to make him. Tessa had asked me that morning why I was even bothering to offer him anything at all, given everything he'd already cost me. I told her the truth, that I wasn't doing it for him. I was doing it because a narrow, honest correction was the fastest way to get one specific lie off my son's record, and speed mattered more to me right now than satisfaction. "I want to be clear about what I'm actually asking for," I said, before Kessler had even settled into the chair across from Elena's desk. "One correction. A statement that the birth week contact log's account of a declined call cannot be verified, and should be withdrawn from any record used to characterize my conduct. That's it. I'm not asking you to confess to a conspiracy." Kessler studied me a long moment, something calculating behind his careful composure, the same look I imagined he wore across a negotiating table when he sensed an opponent offering less resistance than expected. "That's a remarkably modest request, Mr. Mercer, given everything currently in motion around you and everyone else in this building. It's the only thing I actually need from you. Theo doesn't need your confession. He needs the specific lie about me corrected, so it stops shadowing whatever access I eventually get to him." My voice stayed level, watching him weigh the offer like a man checking for a trap he couldn't quite locate. "You walk away with your job. I walk away with one clean fact. Nobody else gets pulled into it any further than they already are." I appreciate the restraint. He said it smoothly, though his tone had already shifted, recalibrating toward an angle I recognized a half-second before he voiced it. "Let me propose an alternative that might serve us both better. A revised statement, confidential, agreed by both parties, that softens the original language without formally retracting the underlying record. Something that protects your reputation going forward without requiring the hospital to admit an error that was, at worst, a documentation ambiguity. That's not a correction. That's a better-dressed version of the same lie." I felt the old anger rise and made myself set it down carefully, the way I'd learned to over months of exactly this kind of room. "You want language soft enough that the note stays technically defensible, while I get just enough relief to stop pushing. I'm not interested in soft, Mr. Kessler. I'm interested in true. Documentation ambiguity is a reasonable, defensible characterization of an imperfect historical record. Kessler's voice hardened slightly, the smoothness thinning into something more brittle underneath. I'd also note that a confidential settlement could include a modest financial component to reflect the genuine hardship this situation has caused you and your business. You're offering me money again. Different room, same offer Vivian made me in a garage months ago. I almost laughed, though nothing about the moment actually felt funny. I didn't take it from her either. I'm not taking it from you. I don't want to be paid to stop wanting the truth, Kessler. That's not a price. That's a different kind of lie. Then I'm not certain what you actually want from this meeting, Mr. Mercer. If not money, and not the softened language I've offered. Kessler's composure had a thin edge to it now, something almost genuinely bewildered underneath the professional calm. Most men in your position would take either option. Frequently both, and gladly, once the exhaustion sets in properly. Most men in my position weren't handed the exact number I was handed the day I found out my son was alive. I held his eyes, unwilling to let him retreat into confusion as a strategy. I want the truth corrected because it's true, not because it's profitable. I understand that's a hard sentence for a man like you to actually process, given the career you've built avoiding it. Elena, silent until now, finally spoke, her voice carrying the precision she reserved for moments that mattered most. Mr. Kessler, I want to be certain the record reflects exactly what's being offered and declined here today. Given what's coming from your governance board's deadline, are you formally declining Mr. Mercer's narrow correction request? Kessler was quiet a moment, something working behind his composed face that looked, in a way I'd never once caught before, like a man running out of clean angles to retreat toward. I'm declining the specific framing proposed. I'll be submitting my own formal response to the partnership review instead, addressing the full context as I understand it. Meaning, I asked it flat, already suspecting the shape of what was coming before he'd even opened his mouth to say it. Meaning the record will reflect that responsibility for any irregularities traces to information and instructions provided by Mrs. Whitmore, information relayed through Ms. Whitmore, and testimony from a retired employee whose reliability remains, in my professional assessment, genuinely in question. He said it without heat, without apology, a man distributing blame across every direction, except the one that led back to his own signature. My note stands as an accurate contemporaneous record. I won't be retracting it. You understand that defense doesn't survive contact with the facts already on record. I leaned forward, incredulous even given everything I already knew about him. My travel timeline, the transfer intake, Helen's account, which the foundation board already found credible enough to suspend a partnership over. You're not defending yourself, Kessler. You're building a version of events that collapses the moment anyone actually reads the file next to it. I'm confident in my position. He gathered his own folder, unhurried, the same practiced calm he'd carried into every room since that first review meeting, though something underneath it had gone visibly thinner today. I'll be filing the formal response by the deadline. I don't expect either of us to be satisfied with the outcome, Mr. Mercer, but I intend to protect my own professional standing by whatever legitimate means remain available to me. He left without another word, buttoning his jacket in the doorway with the same unhurried precision he brought to everything. A man determined to exit, looking like the winner, even as the walls around that story kept closing in behind him. Elena waited until the door clicked shut, before she let out a breath that carried more than professional detachment in it. He just chose the worst available option, Daniel. He had a narrow, survivable exit sitting right in front of him, and he walked past it towards something that's going to blow up in his own hands. Why would he do that? I sat back, genuinely bewildered, watching 6 years of careful, bloodless self-protection apparently curdle into something reckless in a single afternoon. Because men like Kessler don't know how to accept a small loss gracefully. He spent 30 years believing that narrowing responsibility always works, that there's always a smaller room to retreat into. Elena shook her head slowly. He doesn't understand yet that he's out of smaller rooms. Vivian's not protecting him anymore. The foundation's turned, and Helen's statement is formal now. He just doesn't know how to be the man who admits that in a chair across from you. So, what happens when his filing actually contradicts the record? Formally, on paper, in front of a governance board that already suspended one partnership over this exact pattern. I needed to hear her say it plainly, because some part of me still expected another quiet retreat from him at the last possible hour, the way he'd retreated so many times before. Then he's made himself the story instead of you, which is precisely the outcome he's spent this entire process trying to avoid. Elena gathered her own notes, satisfied in the careful, unshowy way she allowed herself to be satisfied. You didn't do that to him, him, Daniel. He did it to himself. Today, in this room, in front of a witness who's going to remember exactly how it happened. I thought about the man I'd watched walk into every room since that first conference table, folder in hand, always one careful step ahead. I understood, with a strange mixture of exhaustion and something almost like pity, that I just watched him make the one mistake he'd spent his entire career avoiding, all by himself, without a single push from me. My phone buzzed before I'd even made it back to the truck. A text from Claire. 3 lines that told me exactly where this was about to land next. My mother called. She wants Graham and me at the house tonight. She said she needs one final version everyone agrees to, before Kessler's filing makes the choice for all of us. I stood in the parking lot a long moment, reading it twice, understanding what had just happened underneath the plane. Careful sentences Claire had chosen to send me. Whatever quiet, narrow correction I'd hoped to secure today had just been traded for something considerably larger and more dangerous. A family was being summoned one last time to decide whether fear could still hold a story together that had already started coming apart in every direction Vivian could no longer control, no matter how loud she raised her voice tonight. Claire called me at 11 that night, voice hoarse, to tell me the family meeting had gone about as badly as any of us could have predicted. Vivian had demanded a unified statement one final time, in her own living room, in front of both of them. Graham had refused before she'd even finished the sentence. Claire had refused a half second after him. She screamed at me, Daniel. Actually screamed, for the first time in my whole life. Said I was destroying everything she'd built to protect us. Claire's voice shook. Exhausted rather than frightened now. I told her the only thing she'd actually protected was her own control, and I watched her realize, in real time, that I finally believed that instead of just suspecting it. Elena arranged the settlement conference for 2 days later, careful and deliberate about who held what authority in the room. This is a child-centered proceeding, she told me on the drive over. You and Claire hold parental decision authority. Vivian attends only because Claire's permitting it. Graham attends because his bond with Theo is real and matters to any workable outcome. Nobody else gets a vote who doesn't actually have one. The conference room sat in a quiet annex of the courthouse, softer than the courtroom where I'd taken my worst loss. A round table instead of a bench and gavel. A space built for people trying to actually solve something instead of simply winning it. Vivian arrived last, composed, dressed for battle, in the same charcoal she'd worn to that first family review, though her whole bearing had changed since I'd last seen her. A woman running low on the specific currency she'd spent her whole life accumulating. I had spent months afraid of this woman, and it took walking into that soft-lit room to finally see how much of her power had only ever been the fear she rented out to the people around her. All of it coming due now, at once, with no one left willing to pay. I want to be direct about what I expect to happen here today. She said it before anyone else could set the room's tone, addressing the table generally, though her eyes stayed fixed on me. I expect Mr. Mercer to demand full custody, punitive restrictions on this family, and whatever public humiliation his lawyer can arrange. I've prepared Claire and Graham for that outcome. I'd like everyone to at least acknowledge we're not naive about what's coming. You've prepared them for a version of me that doesn't actually exist, Vivian. My voice came out level, though something in me wanted badly to let the last months of exhaustion show through anyway. I'm not here for full custody. I'm not here for punishment or public humiliation. I'm here to propose something considerably smaller and considerably harder for you to fight against. She studied me, wary, recalculating in real time the way I'd watched her do in every room since the afternoon she first tried to buy me off. Go on then, I'm listening. A gradual parenting arrangement. Shared decisions between Claire and me going forward on anything that actually matters to Theo's life. Independent, child-centered oversight. Someone neutral checking in on how the transition is actually landing for him, not managed by either family. I laid it out plain, the same way I'd laid out every hard thing across this entire fight. No immediate change to his home or his school. He stays exactly where he's stable, while the rest of this settles around him instead of on top of him. That's it. Vivian's composure flickered, genuine confusion showing through the composure she'd walked in wearing. You're not asking for custody. You're not asking for me removed from his life entirely. I am asking for 3 things, and I won't move on any of them. I held her eyes steady. A truthful account, delivered properly, to Theo. An end to your unilateral control over what he's told and when. Full cooperation with the professional reviews already in motion, foundation and hospital both. That's the whole ask, Vivian. It's not revenge. It's a boundary. The silence that followed had a different quality than every silence I'd sat through in this fight before it. Not the held breath of a room bracing for an attack. The strange, disoriented quiet of people who'd spent months preparing for a war that had just quietly, deliberately declined to happen the way anyone had actually planned for. Vivian recovered first, pivoting the way she always did when one line of attack collapsed, turning toward Graham with the narrow focus of a woman reaching for her last remaining piece on the board. "Graham, you've built a real bond with that boy. 4 years of it. Are you truly prepared to stand here and let a stranger dictate the terms of his entire future?" Graham's jaw tightened, but his voice, when it came, stayed steady in a way I hadn't heard from him before. Something settled, finally landing under all his earlier caution. "I'm not going to use what I have with Theo as a weapon to keep him living inside a lie, Vivian. Not for you. Not to protect a story that was never actually about protecting him in the first place. You'll lose him. Both of you will, eventually. Once the dust settles and he's old enough to understand exactly how messy all of this truly was." Vivian's voice sharpened, urgent now, the practiced calm finally cracking under real pressure I had never once watched it take before. "I am the only person in this family who has ever been willing to make the hard, unpopular choices necessary to actually protect him. You made one hard choice 6 years ago in a genuine emergency, and I understand that choice better than you probably think I do." I let that land before continuing, watching something shift in her expression at the unexpected concession. "Everything after that wasn't protection, Vivian. It was control, dressed up as protection because that dressing let you sleep at night. I've had months to learn the difference. I think it's time you did too." Claire, silent since the meeting began, finally spoke, her voice quiet but carrying into every corner of the small room. "I need to say something, and I need everyone to actually hear it, not just wait for me to finish so you can respond." Everyone turned. Vivian's hand moved slightly toward her daughter, an old reflex, and Claire didn't pull away exactly, but the set of her shoulders made clear the gesture would land on nothing this time. "The first choice was my mother's, made under real terror, in a room I couldn't think straight in. I've said that before, and it's true." Claire's voice stayed steady, though her hands trembled slightly on the table. "But every choice after that first week was mine. The divorce filing, the years of silence. The story I told Theo about a father who chose to leave. I let my mother's fear become my own convenience, and I need to own that completely, in this room, in front of both of you, without any more careful language protecting me from how that actually sounds." "Claire." Vivian's voice had gone thin, something almost pleading in it now. "You don't have to do this here. We can discuss this privately, as a family, the way we always have." "That's exactly the problem, Mother. We've discussed everything privately, as a family, for 6 years, and it's how we ended up here." Claire turned to face her fully now, something final settling into her expression. "I'm withdrawing you as my support in this room. I don't need you managing what I say anymore. I don't need you deciding what version of events protects us best. I can actually speak for myself now." Vivian went very still, the total stillness of someone realizing, all at once, that the ground she'd been standing on had just been formally, permanently withdrawn out from underneath her. "You can't simply remove me from a conversation about my own grandson." "I can, actually. This is a proceeding about parental authority, Vivian, and you don't hold any." Elena's voice cut in, quiet, precise, professional, in a way that left no room for negotiation. "Claire permitted your presence today as a courtesy. She's just revoked that permission. I'd ask you to step outside while we continue." The silence stretched long enough that I watched Vivian actually consider refusing, weighing whether her presence alone still carried enough weight to overrule a room that had just, collectively, decided it didn't need her anymore. Something in Claire's face must have convinced her otherwise. Some finality that hadn't been there in any of their arguments before tonight. She stood slowly, smoothing her jacket with hands that weren't quite as steady as she wanted them to look, and paused at the door with one last attempt at the old authority in her voice. "You'll all regret excluding me from decisions that affect this family. I've protected this family longer than any of you have been capable of protecting yourselves. Maybe. Or maybe you protected your control of this family and called it love because that was easier to live with." I said it without heat, mostly because there was nothing left in me that wanted to spend more energy on cruelty toward a woman who just lost every real thing she'd built her power on. "Either way, Vivian, the room's already decided. That decision doesn't need you standing in it to become real. Not anymore." She left without another word, heels sharp against the courthouse tile, and the door clicked shut behind her, with a finality that felt, after everything, almost anticlimactic. A woman who'd spent months feeling like the central danger in my life, reduced, in the end, to a sound in a hallway growing fainter until it disappeared entirely. Claire exhaled slowly once the door closed, some visible weight lifting off her shoulders that had clearly been sitting there far longer than these last few months. I don't know how to feel right now. I thought this would feel like triumph. It mostly just feels like exhaustion. That sounds about right for something honest, for what it's worth. Triumph rarely feels like this in my experience, and I've sat in more of these rooms than I care to count. I meant it, because triumph had never actually been the promise underneath any of this, only the truth, arrived at slowly, at real cost, by people finally willing to stop protecting a version of events that had never protected any of us at all. What about the professional reviews? Graham asked, before Elena could move fully into paperwork. The foundation, the hospital network. Does any of that actually get resolved by what just happened in this room, or does it just keep grinding on separately? Separately, but not disconnected. Elena pulled out a fresh page, already anticipating exactly the question he was going to ask. Claire's cooperation today, and Vivian's exclusion from this proceeding, both become part of the record those bodies are reviewing. It doesn't finish their work for them. It removes one more excuse for delay. And Vivian, I asked it plainly because I needed to hear the actual mechanism, not just the satisfying shape of the afternoon. She just lost this room. What does she still hold outside it? Less than she did yesterday, and considerably less than she held a month ago. Elena set the page down, meeting my eyes with the same careful precision she'd brought to every hard conversation since the first day I'd walked into her cramped office. She still has money. She no longer has witnesses willing to repeat her story, a board willing to protect her, or a daughter willing to be managed. Elena's voice stayed level. Matter of fact, money alone rarely wins these things, in my experience. It just makes losing take longer than it actually needs to. Elena laid out the framework carefully over the next hour. Gradual expansion of contact tied to Theo's own comfort, joint decision-making on school and medical matters, an independent child advocate checking in quarterly. Nothing rushed, nothing imposed from outside his own pace. Graham stayed through the entire session, present, useful, no longer defending territory so much as helping build something that could actually hold. There's still the truth to tell him, Claire said. Near the end, when the paperwork had mostly settled and the room had gone quiet with the heavy tiredness that follows real, difficult progress. I promised him that weeks ago, and I still haven't done it. Then let's do it together, if you'll let me. Not to take it from you, just so he's not alone in the room when the whole shape of it finally lands. I looked between her and Graham, both of them nodding slowly, something like an actual family forming in the strange, hard-won space where a lie used to live. He's earned that much from all three of us, at the very least. I drove home that night past the courthouse, past the school, past the garage, feeling something I hadn't let myself feel in longer than I could easily remember. Not victory exactly, but something quieter and considerably more durable settling into its place instead. Evelyn called a final foundation session 3 weeks after the settlement conference. The younger board member who'd once wanted my grief for a donor newsletter tried one more time. More carefully this time. He asked whether I'd consider a short public statement about my journey toward reconciliation, worded gently enough that it took me a second to recognize the same pitch wearing a new suit. No, I said it without heat because I'd had 3 full weeks to get comfortable saying it plainly by now. I'll give your reviewers whatever facts protect the next family this happens to. I'm not going to be the redemption story that makes this institution feel better about itself. That's not what accountability is for. Evelyn didn't push it further. By the end of that session, the board had voted on 3 concrete things instead of one polished story. Vivian removed permanently from any leadership or advisory role. The Belhaven Pediatric Network partnership canceled outright rather than merely suspended. Kessler's defense formally referred to the network's independent governance process for professional discipline. He'll likely lose his license to practice hospital administration in this state, Evelyn told me afterward, in the same lobby with the water feature nobody looked at. Not because of what happened 6 years ago, strangely enough, because of the document he filed 3 weeks ago. Trying so hard to survive it, he built his own gallows and climbed up himself, one careful step at a time, alone. I said it without satisfaction, mostly just tired recognition of how thoroughly a man could dig a hole while insisting the whole time that he was standing on solid ground. I didn't need to push him. I just needed to stop giving him easy rooms to retreat into. And eventually, he simply ran out of rooms entirely. The foundation also approved, at my specific and narrow request, an independent patient family advocacy position, funded separately from donor influence, with protections written in for any reviewer who found themselves questioning a family with money attached to their name. It wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of quiet structural change that would matter to someone I'd never meet. Years from now, in exactly the position I'd been standing in. Helen Cho sent a card that week, unexpected, a few plain lines thanking me for not making her into a headline after everything she'd risked to finally speak. I called her instead of writing back, and we talked for 20 minutes about nothing important, weather in her garden, and a wind chime collection she was mildly embarrassed about, which felt like exactly the right way to close out a long, heavy year I was more than ready to end. The Hargrove situation took longer to settle and settled smaller. Bill's fleet manager called Tessa in early spring, cautious, testing the water before Bill himself would commit to anything. He wants to talk, not apologize exactly. Talk. Tessa relayed it flatly, unimpressed, already 3 steps ahead of whatever proposal was coming. I told him we're not interested in a guilt contract. If he wants back in, it's on our terms, our rates, and no special treatment because he feels bad about how it ended. Bill came in person the following week, older looking somehow, chastened in a way that suited him better than his earlier discomfort had. I want to renew. Full terms, no discount, no favor. I let a rumor decide something a set of invoices should have decided instead. And that's on me to fix properly, not you to forgive quietly. Then we'll draw up a contract like anybody else's client. Bill. Market rate. Standard terms. Quarterly review. Tessa shook his hand, businesslike. No warmth performed for the occasion that hadn't actually been earned back yet. This isn't charity work, and it isn't a redemption arc either. It's just good business, finally landing the right way. He signed within the week, and the garage's numbers climbed back towards something like what they'd been before. Not through any dramatic rescue, just steady work, properly priced, done well every single day, the way Tessa had promised it would eventually add back up. You know what the real revenge is, Tessa said, watching Bill's fleet manager drive the first renewed van off the lot, making him pay full price for something he almost lost for free. There's a lesson in there about respecting your mechanics that I hope sticks with him a lot longer than the paint job will. You're unnervingly good at revenge for someone who insists she isn't interested in it. I handed her the signed contract to file, grease still faintly visible on one corner where she'd handled it straight from the shop. Remind me never to actually make you angry on purpose. Too late for that particular warning, Daniel. You've been testing that theory since the day you walked back into my garage with a grief the size of a house and somehow talked me into a partnership anyway. She grinned, filing the contract without any further ceremony. Turned out fine, though. Mostly, ask me again in another 6 years. Theo's truth-telling happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, at Claire's kitchen table. All 3 of us there, because he'd asked for that specifically, once Claire finally set the date. No strangers, no extra chairs, just the people who actually mattered to the answer. Graham made grilled cheese, badly cut into triangles too small for the bread, and nobody mentioned it because the moment didn't have room for anything except the actual conversation. Claire told most of it herself. Simple language, no more managing, no more careful softening, designed to protect herself instead of him. Theo listened with the same suspicious, evaluating focus he'd given every hard fact since the missing axle pin, asking 2 or 3 plain questions and accepting the plain answers without drama. So, nobody actually thought I died. Grandma just told everyone that, and you all just went along with it for years without checking. He said it slowly, working through the shape of 6 years compressed into 20 careful minutes. That's really stupid, honestly. Grown-ups are supposed to be better at this than that. You're not wrong, I told him, because lying to him about the stupidity of it felt worse than admitting it plainly. Grown-ups get scared and make choices that look smart at the time and turn out to be pretty stupid a few years later. I hope you remember that part when you're older and think you know everything. That got the smallest, reluctant curl of a smile out of him. Gone fast, but real, and something in the room finally exhaled after 20 of the longest minutes any of us had lived through together. The gradual schedule built itself slowly over the following months, exactly the way Elena had designed it. Weekday dinners first, then occasional overnights. Theo asked for the first overnight himself, unprompted, the same way he'd once asked to see the fixed birdhouse roof, like the request only mattered if it came from him and nobody else. Claire and I settled into something that looked, from the outside, almost boring. A shared calendar, careful handoffs at the door, brief practical conversations about school forms and dentist appointments that no longer carried 6 years of unspoken weight behind every sentence. We were never going to be friends exactly, not after everything, But we became something steadier and more useful than friendship. Two people who'd finally agreed to tell each other the truth, even when it cost something to say out loud. Graham stayed exactly where he belonged, present at recitals and library programs, never asked to shrink himself, never trying to expand past the space that was actually his. He and I fell into an easy, low-stakes rivalry over which of us Theo would ask for help with any given project, tracked with entirely too much seriousness by both of us. Graham currently led, by his own careful count, 4 birdhouses to my 3 engine repairs, a scoreboard neither of us would ever openly admit to actually keeping, though Tessa mocked us both for it constantly. Maisie declared herself Theo's official older sister adjacent authority sometime that spring, a title nobody had offered her, and she'd simply claimed for herself with total confidence. The two of them spent one entire Saturday building a second, more ambitious birdhouse that collapsed twice, before Tessa finally intervened with an opinion about load-bearing angles neither child particularly wanted to hear from an adult. "You're both wrong," she told them, hands on her hips, surveying the wreckage of attempt number 2. "The problem isn't the roof, it's that neither of you will admit the base is crooked. Fix the base first. Always fix the base first." Theo looked at me across the workbench, the exact suspicious, appraising look he'd given a missing axle pin the first day I'd ever met him. "Is that actually true? Or is that one of those things adults say that sounds smart, but isn't?" "It's actually true. Also applies to more than birdhouses, if you're paying attention." I handed him the level, because some lessons land better through a tool than through a lecture. "Check the base. Every single time. Saves you from rebuilding the whole thing later." He checked it, found it crooked exactly the way Tessa had said, and spent the next 20 minutes re-leveling the foundation with the same stubborn, methodical focus he brought to everything that actually mattered to him. He muttered the whole time under his breath about grown-ups who turned out to be right more often than was strictly fair to a kid trying to prove a point. It was late August, almost a year after the playground, when it finally happened. Ordinary and unplanned, exactly the way I'd stopped expecting it ever would. He'd scraped his knee running across the garage lot, more indignant than hurt, and I'd crouched down to look at it the way I'd looked at his thumb that day over sandwiches. "It's fine. Just mad, not bleeding." He inspected it himself first, same diagnosis he'd have made months ago, then looked up at me with something easy and unguarded in his face that hadn't been there in all the careful months before this one. "Can you get the bandages, Dad? The good ones, not the boring kind. You know exactly which ones I mean. The dinosaur ones." He said it like it weighed nothing at all, already turning back toward Maisie and whatever argument they'd resume the second his knee stopped stinging. I stood there a moment longer than the bandages actually required, letting one ordinary word finally land the way 6 years of waiting had never quite let it land before today. "Yeah, bud." My voice came out steadier than I expected, though something considerably larger than a scraped knee had just quietly settled into place behind it, 6 years finally landing somewhere solid. "I'll get the good ones, dinosaurs and all."
Daniel spent 6 years grieving a son who was never dead, and when he found the boy alive, the easy story was revenge. To expose the lie, take the child, and punish everyone who built it. He refused that story. What all of this really turns on is the difference between being right and being trusted. Daniel could prove paternity in a lab and stop a move in a courtroom and still lose Theo because a relationship is not a verdict you win. It is a thing you earn in kept promises and fixed hinges and boundaries you honor even when they cost you. The people who tried to own the boy, through money, through fear, through a piece of paper that only looked official, lost the moment truth became safer than their control. If there is anything worth carrying out of it, it is this: presence beats possession, steadiness outlasts any grand gesture, and the strongest thing a wronged man can do is refuse the cruelty everyone expects of him and choose the slower, truer way back to the people who matter.